Who were the Scythians, and how did riders of the open steppe shape a world without cities, borders or walls? From endless grasslands and golden warriors to fire rituals, frozen tombs and legends of Amazons, their story stretches farther than history often remembers. Tonight, we journey across the steppe to uncover who they were, how they lived, and why their echoes still ride the plains. Before we begin, feel free to subscribe and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. The endless grasslands, where the Scythians first rode, far beyond the lands of walls and cities, beyond the rivers where stone temples reflected in still water, there stretched a world that refused to be contained, a world where the horizon never settled, where the earth rolled endlessly beneath a sky so wide it felt almost alive. This was the steppe, a sea of grass moving with the wind, shaped not by human hands but by time itself. To those who lived at its edges, the steppe seemed empty, a place without landmarks, without borders, without meaning, but to those born within it, the steppe was everything. It was memory, it was movement, it was survival, and it was here, in this open and demanding world, that the people later known as the Scythians first learned how to live. Long before they were named, long before they were feared or admired, these people existed as part of the land's rhythm. They followed no fixed roads. They built no permanent cities. Their lives unfolded across seasons rather than generations, guided by grass growth, animal migration, water availability, and the changing mood of the sky. In spring, the plains awakened. Fresh grass is pushed through the soil, soft and bright beneath the sun. Herds gathered, drawn by nourishment. Camps stirred into motion, wagons rolling slowly across familiar routes remembered through generations. In summer, the steppe stretched wide and dry, shimmering under heat. The land demanded care, attention, restraint. In autumn, winds sharpened and preparations began, and in winter, the steppe revealed its true power, cold, vast, unforgiving, yet never silent. This was not a land that allowed stillness. Those who lingered too long in one place risked starvation, exposure, or isolation. Survival belonged to those who moved, not randomly, but with knowledge etched deeply into memory. The people who would become the Scythians learned this truth early. Their identity was shaped not by a homeland fixed to soil, but by an understanding of motion itself. Before the horse, movement across the steppe was slow and exhausting. Distances stretched endlessly, but as humans and horses formed a bond, the world changed. Riding was not merely transportation, it was transformation. The horse collapsed distance. It turned danger into opportunity. It turned the open plains into a living network of paths only the initiated could read. With the horse, the steppe became navigable. With the horse, the steppe became home. Children grew up among herds. They learned balance before discipline, awareness before authority. Riding was instinctive, woven into daily life. Horses were not possessions. They were extensions of the body, partners in survival. To lose a horse was to lose mobility, security, and connection to the land. Camps moved like breathing organisms. Wagons creaked softly as they crossed grasslands, carrying families, tools, food stores, and the memory of previous seasons. Felt tents were raised and lowered with practiced ease. Fires burned briefly, then vanished without trace. When a camp moved on, the land slowly reclaimed the space, leaving almost nothing behind. There were no walls to defend, no cities to siege, no fixed centres of power. Authority existed through reputation, experience, and skill rather than architecture. Knowledge mattered more than ownership. Elders were valued not for wealth, but for memory, for knowing where water hid beneath the soil, where storms gathered, where herds would return year after year. Above everything, the sky ruled. Without forests or mountains to obstruct the view, the heavens became an ever-present guide. Stars marked direction, constellations tracked time, cloud formations warned of storms long before thunder rolled across the plains. The steppe taught its people to look upward as much as outward. To settled civilizations, this way of life seemed chaotic. Greek writers would later describe the Scythians as wild, rootless, untamed. Persian kings would struggle to comprehend enemies who refused to defend cities or meet armies on fixed ground. But beneath the surface, Scythian life followed an internal order as strict as any law code. Movement was calculated, routes were remembered, seasons were respected, burial mounds rose across the plains, marking ancestral presence. Though the Scythians did not build cities, they anchored memory through these silent monuments, tying identity to lineage rather than location. The dead remained part of the land, even as the living moved endlessly across it. The steppe was not a void between civilizations. It was a corridor. Through it flowed trade, ideas, metals, animals, and stories. The Scythians stood at the heart of this network. They connected worlds that never fully understood one another. Goods from distant regions passed through their hands. Information travelled with their movements. They were not isolated. They were intermediaries. As dusk settled across the grasslands, the steppe softened. Winds calmed. Horses clustered close. Fires glowed low, illuminating faces shaped by weather and motion. Stories passed quietly from voice to voice. Not myths written down, but memories shared and reshaped across generations. Tales of great rides, dangerous storms, fierce encounters, and ancestral wisdom. In these moments, the steppe revealed its deeper nature. It was not empty. It was observant. It held memory differently, not through buildings or texts, but through repetition, rhythm, and return. The Scythians belonged to this land not by claiming it, but by understanding it. Their strength came from adaptability, from knowing when to move and when to wait, from trusting horses, sky, and memory more than walls or permanence. This was the beginning of their story, not written in stone, but traced across grasslands by hooves and wheels. From this open world would rise warriors feared by empires, artists who shaped gold into living animals, and a culture that ruled the steppe for centuries without ever standing still. And it all began here, under the open sky, within the endless grasslands, where the Scythians first rode. The land did not merely support life on the steppe, it shaped it, quietly and relentlessly. Every choice the Scythians made, every habit they formed, every value they held was a response to the demands of this open world. There was no shelter from distance here, no refuge from exposure. The steppe rewarded attentiveness and punished complacency. Over time, this created a people finely tuned to their surroundings, alert to change and comfortable with uncertainty. Movement became instinctive. Camps did not wait for hardship to arrive. They moved ahead of it. When grasses thinned, when water receded, when winds carried unfamiliar scents, the Scythians responded without hesitation. Routes were not improvised, they were remembered. The land was mapped not on parchment, but in minds trained from childhood to recognize subtle signs. The angle of hills, the behaviour of animals, the way clouds gathered on the horizon. This memory of the land was collective. Knowledge was shared constantly, woven into conversation, instruction and story. Children absorbed it by listening, by watching, by riding alongside elders. There were no formal lessons, no written rules, yet the education was relentless and precise. To misjudge the steppe could cost lives. In this world, Wealth did not accumulate in buildings or fields. It lived in herds, in horses especially, animals prized not only for their strength and speed, but for their endurance and intelligence. Horses were selected carefully, bred over generations to withstand long journeys, harsh winters and sudden storms. A skilled rider could read a horse's movement as easily as another might read words, sensing fatigue, fear, or readiness long before it became visible. The relationship between rider and horse was intimate and constant. Together, they crossed distances that would have broken others. Together, they hunted, travelled, escaped, and returned. In time, this bond shaped Scythian identity so deeply that to imagine one without the other became impossible. The steppe also shaped how the Scythians understood power. Authority did not come from fixed thrones or permanent capitals. It emerged through leadership proven in motion, through successful migrations, wise decisions, and the ability to protect the group. Leaders were those who could guide people through uncertainty, who understood when to advance and when to withdraw. Conflict, when it arose, followed the logic of the land. Battles were fluid, fast, and rarely fixed in one place. The open plains favoured speed and manoeuvrability over rigid formations. Knowledge of terrain mattered more than numbers. Retreat was not weakness, it was strategy. Survival depended on flexibility, not stubbornness. Yet the steppe was not only a place of struggle, it was also a space of profound quiet. There were long hours when nothing moved but grass and sky, when the world seemed to hold its breath. In these moments, people found meaning not through monuments, but through presence. The vastness itself invited reflection. Under an unbroken sky, human life felt both small and deeply connected to everything around it. This sense of connection shaped early Scythian belief. Though much of their spiritual world remains elusive, it is clear that the steppe itself was sacred. The sky, the earth, fire, and animals were not distant concepts but living forces encountered daily. Rituals did not require temples, they unfolded under open air, where the boundary between human and natural worlds felt thin. Burial practices reflected this worldview. The dead were placed into the earth with care, often accompanied by items that spoke to their lives. Weapons, ornaments, tools, horses. Burial mounds rose across the plains like quiet markers of memory. They did not anchor people to a single place, but they reminded the living that the land remembered them, even as they moved on. Over generations, these mounds accumulated, creating a subtle geography of ancestry. The steppe was not empty after all. It was layered with presence, with the lives of those who had passed through before. As centuries unfolded, the Scythians' movements carried them farther across the plains. From the northern shores of the Black Sea to the vast expanses of Central Asia, their presence spread like a slow tide. They adapted to local conditions, interacted with neighbouring peoples, and absorbed influences without losing the core of their identity. Through this expansion, the steppe became a bridge between worlds. Goods moved across it, metals, textiles, animals, ideas moved too, technologies, artistic styles, stories. The Scythians did not isolate themselves from surrounding civilizations. They interacted with them on their own terms, shaping and being shaped in return. Still, at the heart of Scythian life remained the endless grasslands. No matter how far they travelled, no matter whom they encountered, the open steppe continued to define who they were. It taught them resilience without rigidity, freedom without chaos, and continuity without permanence. As night fell across the plains, stars emerged one by one, filling the sky with cold light. Camps settled into quiet rhythms. Horses grazed softly. Fires flickered low. The land stretched outward, familiar and unknowable at once. This was the world that gave rise to the Scythians, a world of motion and memory, of wind and hoofbeats, of people shaped not by walls but by horizons. And from this beginning their story would continue to unfold into warfare and art, gold and ritual, myth and encounter, carried always by the steady movement of life across the steppe. Nomads of the steppe and the birth of horse cultures, the rhythm of life on the steppe unfolded slowly, repeating itself across generations in patterns so steady they felt timeless. Morning light crept across the grasslands, touching dew on blades of grass, stirring herds into motion. Camps awakened quietly. There was no sudden rush, no sharp division between night and day. Life eased forward, shaped by habit and awareness rather than schedules. The Scythians learned early that survival depended not on conquering the land, but on listening to it. The steppe spoke in subtle ways, in the direction of wind before a storm, in the behaviour of animals sensing distant danger, in the scent of rain carried long before clouds appeared. Those who learned to listen thrived. Those who did not were eventually claimed by the vastness around them. Every journey reinforced this bond. Riders crossed familiar routes not because they were marked, but because memory held them. Hills, river bends, lone trees, changes in soil texture. These were landmarks as reliable as any carved stone. Over time, the steppe itself became a living archive, its geography layered with experience. The Scythians did not measure distance in miles. They measured it in time, in effort, in endurance. A place was not defined by how far it lay, but by how long it took to reach, by how much water and grass stood along the way, by how the land felt beneath hoof and wheel. Movement was never random. Even in a world that seemed open and endless, paths existed, invisible but deeply known. Within camps, life followed the same quiet order. Tasks were shared without formal hierarchy. Some tended animals, others repaired equipment, prepared food, crafted tools. Children moved freely among adults, absorbing skills naturally. There was no sharp line between learning and living. Knowledge flowed continuously, passed on through example rather than instruction. Food came from many sources. Herd animals provided meat, milk, hides and bone. Hunting supplemented this supply, especially during seasonal migrations when wild game followed predictable patterns. Nothing was wasted. Every part of an animal held value, shaped by generations of careful use. In a land where resources could vanish quickly, efficiency was not optional, it was instinct. Even leisure carried purpose. When people rested, they repaired tools, told stories, sang songs shaped by rhythm rather than melody. These moments of stillness were not separate from survival. They reinforced it, strengthening bonds within the group and preserving memory. Stories reminded listeners where they came from, which paths were dangerous, which ancestors were honoured, which mistakes should never be repeated. As time passed, the Scythians became increasingly skilled riders, archers and travellers. Their ability to move swiftly across open terrain gave them an advantage that outsiders struggled to understand. To settled peoples, land was something to be controlled. To the Scythians, land was something to be navigated. This difference would shape future encounters in ways neither side could fully predict. Yet for now, in these early centuries, conflict remained distant. The steppe was wide enough to absorb tension, to allow groups to avoid one another if needed. When disputes arose, they were often resolved through movement rather than confrontation. Distance itself acted as a mediator. The open sky continued to dominate every aspect of existence. Weather shaped decisions daily. A single storm could change plans, alter routes, force unexpected delays. Over time, Scythians learned not to resist these changes, but to accommodate them. Flexibility became a form of strength. This adaptability extended beyond the physical world into thought itself. Life on the steppe encouraged acceptance of uncertainty. Nothing was guaranteed. Not safety, not abundance, not permanence. Yet this uncertainty fostered resilience. The Scythians learned to trust process rather than outcome, journey rather than destination. It is difficult to overstate how deeply this worldview shaped their identity. They did not seek to leave permanent marks upon the land. Their presence was light, almost temporary, even as it endured across centuries. Where others built monuments to assert control, the Scythians built continuity through movement. The burial mounds, scattered across the plains, stood as quiet exceptions. These were places where motion paused, where memory settled briefly into earth. Each mound marked a life lived in motion, a story completed. They reminded the living that even in a world defined by movement, remembrance mattered. At night, when the steppe darkened and stars burned sharply overhead, silence took on weight. Fires crackled softly, horses shifted in their sleep. The vastness around the camps felt neither threatening nor empty, but attentive, as though the land itself observed, remembered, and endured alongside its people. This was the world that shaped the Scythians before they were known to history, before Greek writers described them, before Persian kings feared them, before gold gleamed in their tombs, before legends formed around their warriors. They were, first and foremost, children of the grasslands, shaped by wind, sky, and motion. Their story began not with conquest or empire, but with adaptation, patience, and an understanding that life could be lived fully without ever standing still. And from this foundation, from these endless grasslands where they first rode, everything else would follow. The steppe carried them forward, season after season, teaching lessons that no other land could offer. Each return to familiar grazing grounds reinforced the idea that time was circular rather than linear. What had happened before would happen again, not in exact detail, but in rhythm. Spring would return. Herds would migrate. Winds would rise and fall. In this repetition, the Scythians found a stability without permanence. As years passed, these rhythms shaped not only survival, but identity. A person was known not by where they lived, but by how they moved. Reputation travelled faster than any caravan. Stories of skill, generosity, endurance and wisdom flowed along invisible routes across the plains. In a world without borders, word itself became a kind of currency. The Scythians learned early that cooperation mattered more than domination. A single family could not survive the steppe alone. Camps relied on shared effort, shared vigilance, shared memory. When danger approached, whether from predators, harsh weather, or rival groups, it was sensed collectively and addressed together. The land encouraged this unity, reminding everyone that isolation invited vulnerability. Over time, subtle distinctions emerged among groups. Variations in dress, ornamentation, and custom reflected local conditions and inherited traditions. Yet beneath these differences lay a common language of movement. Horses, wagons, grazing cycles, and sky-bound navigation bound the Scythian world together more tightly than walls ever could. The steppe also shaped their sense of time. Without calendars carved into stone, time was measured through experience. A child's age was counted in winter survived. Journeys were remembered by storms endured or rivers crossed. History lived in memory, refreshed through retelling rather than record. This made the past feel close, never distant. Ancestors were not abstract figures. They were companions whose paths still guided the living. This closeness to ancestry deepened respect for tradition. Innovations occurred, but slowly, carefully, tested against the unforgiving demands of the land. Tools evolved in response to need. Riding techniques refined themselves through experience. clothing adapted to temperature and movement. Nothing unnecessary survived for long. As the Scythians grew more confident in their mastery of the steppe, their range expanded naturally. They followed herds farther. They explored new river systems. They learned which regions offered shelter during harsh winters and which should be avoided. With each expansion, their understanding of the world grew broader, yet their connection to the core rhythms of steppe life remained intact. Encounters with other peoples became more frequent. Traders appeared at the edges of the plains, drawn by horses, hides, and knowledge of routes. These interactions were cautious but curious. Exchange occurred not only in goods, but in ideas. Metalworking techniques, decorative styles, and stories travelled quietly along these encounters. The Scythians absorbed what suited their way of life and let the rest pass by. Despite this growing network, the steppe retained its primacy. It was not merely a backdrop for Scythian culture, it was its foundation. Every choice, where to move, when to gather, how to respond to change, was filtered through an understanding of the land's vastness and unpredictability. At dawn, riders scanned the horizon instinctively. At dusk, camps settled into familiar arrangements. At night, stars turned slowly overhead, marking the passage of time in a way no monument could. Life flowed onward, unbroken, resilient. This long shaping, this patient partnership between people and place, prepared the Scythians for what lay ahead. It forged riders capable of crossing immense distances, warriors adapted to fluid combat, artists attuned to animal forms and motion, and communities able to endure upheaval without losing themselves. The endless grasslands had done their work. From these plains would emerge the Scythians known to history, feared by empires, admired for their skill, remembered for their gold and their speed. But beneath all later legend and conflict remained this quieter truth. Before they were warriors, traders, or rulers of the steppe, they were listeners. Listeners to wind, listeners to hoofbeats, listeners to the land itself. And it was in listening that they first learned how to ride, not only across grass and sky, but across time itself. Warriors of gold, bows, and the open sky. Across the open grasslands, beneath a sky that offered no shelter and no boundaries, the Scythians became warriors not by choice, but by necessity. The steppe did not allow weakness, nor did it tolerate hesitation. Survival required vigilance, adaptability, and a readiness to respond to sudden change. From this environment emerged a form of warfare inseparable from daily life, shaped by movement rather than fortification, and guided by instinct sharpened through generations. The Scythian warrior was never confined to a battlefield. There were no designated arenas for combat, no fixed borders where war began and ended. Conflict could arise anywhere, along a migration route, near a water source, or across open plains where rival groups crossed paths. Because of this, every adult rider carried the potential of a warrior within them. Weapons were not ceremonial objects reserved for moments of conflict. They were tools carried as naturally as riding gear. From childhood, Scythians learned to ride as an extension of the body. Balance, control, and awareness developed early, long before formal concepts of training existed. A child's first experiences on horseback were not lessons in dominance, but in partnership. The horse was not merely directed, it was understood. Riders learned to move with its rhythm, to anticipate its reactions, to trust its instincts as much as their own. This bond between rider and horse formed the foundation of Scythian warfare. The open steppe demanded speed. It rewarded those who could strike quickly and vanish just as fast. Heavy armour and rigid formations had little place here. Instead, Scythian warriors relied on mobility and precision. Their primary weapon, the composite bow, embodied this philosophy perfectly. Crafted from layers of wood, horn, and sinew, it stored immense power in a compact form. Short enough to be used from horseback, yet strong enough to pierce armour at distance, it allowed riders to engage without ever slowing. Archery was not simply a skill, it was a language. Riders learned to judge distance instinctively, to account for wind, movement, and terrain without conscious calculation. Arrows were loosed at full gallop, sometimes forward, sometimes sideways, sometimes backward in the fluid manoeuvre, later known as the Parthian shot. To an outside observer, this seemed almost impossible, yet to the Scythians, it was the natural result of growing up in motion. Their combat style reflected the land itself. Rather than confront enemies head-on, Scythian warriors favoured constant pressure. They harassed, encircled, withdrew, and returned. Enemies were forced to chase, to exhaust themselves across open terrain where shelter was scarce and orientation difficult. Victory came not from decisive clashes, but from attrition, from wearing down both morale and strength. This method of warfare baffled settled civilizations. Persian armies, accustomed to disciplined formations and planned engagements, found themselves unable to force battle on Scythian terms. Greek observers described enemies who seemed to dissolve into the horizon, only to reappear unexpectedly. To those trained to defend walls and cities, a people who refused to stand still felt almost unreal. Yet Scythian warfare was not chaotic. It followed an internal logic shaped by experience. Riders knew when to engage and when to retreat. Withdrawal was not shameful, it was strategic. The goal was not domination, but survival and advantage. To live another season was often more important than to claim territory. When close combat became unavoidable, Scythians adapted quickly. Short swords, daggers, and spears were designed for swift, decisive strikes. Armour remained light, prioritising movement over protection. Shields were uncommon, as speed and distance provided better defence than weight ever could. Even in hand-to-hand combat, mobility remained central. Gold entered this martial world not as excess, but as expression. Unlike settled societies where wealth accumulated in buildings or treasuries, Scythian wealth travelled with them. Gold adorned weapons, clothing, and horse gear, transforming functional items into statements of identity. The artistry was extraordinary. Animals rendered in motion, muscles tensed, bodies coiled or leaping. These were not static symbols. They reflected a worldview defined by movement. Predators appeared frequently: lions, leopards, wolves, embodying vigilance and strength. Birds symbolized vision and freedom. Stags, often depicted with flowing antlers and elongated bodies, seemed to capture the spirit of the steppe itself. Alert, swift, enduring. These images were not chosen at random. They mirrored the qualities Scythian warriors valued and aspired to. Weapons became carriers of meaning. A bow decorated with animal motifs was not only a tool of war, but a reminder of balance between human and natural forces. Gold plates sewn onto clothing caught sunlight as riders moved, creating flashes of brilliance across the plains, a visual language of presence and confidence. Horse equipment received equal attention. Bridles, harnesses and saddles were carefully adorned, reflecting the central role of the horse in Scythian life. Rider and mount formed a single moving figure, both decorated, both honoured. In burial, horses were often interred alongside warriors, emphasising a bond believed to continue beyond life itself. Despite their fearsome reputation, Scythian warriors were not driven by constant aggression. The steppe could not sustain endless war. Conflict was purposeful, aimed at securing resources, defending routes, or asserting presence. Prolonged violence disrupted migration patterns and threatened survival. As a result, warfare was balanced by restraint. Leadership among warriors emerged from demonstrated ability rather than fixed hierarchy. A successful leader was one who guided others safely through danger, who chose engagements wisely, who protected the group's long-term well-being. Authority was reinforced through reputation and shared experience, not decrees. After raids or conflicts, wealth was redistributed through feasting and gift-giving. Success strengthened communal bonds rather than isolating individuals. Gold flowed not into vaults, but into shared rituals that reinforced unity and memory. At night, camps returned to quiet. Weapons were cleaned, horses rested, fires burned low against the vast darkness. Stories passed softly, accounts of journeys, warnings remembered, victories earned through patience rather than force. These stories did not glorify violence alone. They taught caution, adaptability, and respect for the land. Above everything, the open sky remained unchanged. Stars watched as warriors slept beneath felt tents or open air, boughs within reach, horses close by. The same sky that guided migration and marked time also framed their understanding of existence. Vast, indifferent, yet deeply familiar. This was Scythian warfare at its core, not domination through walls and armies, but mastery of movement beneath an open world. Their strength lay not in holding territory, but in knowing when to appear and when to vanish. Feared by empires, admired by chroniclers, remembered through gold and legend, the Scythian warrior was shaped above all by space, by the endless grasslands and the open sky that demanded readiness without rigidity. And this way of war, forged through generations of motion, would shape every encounter the Scythians would have with the ancient world. As the years unfolded, the Scythian way of war settled into something deeper than technique. It became a mindset shaped by the steppe itself, an understanding that strength was not loud or rigid, but patient, responsive, and aware. A warrior did not rush toward danger blindly. He or she watched first, listened, waited. The open land rewarded those who could read its moods. Scythian warriors learned to move as part of the landscape. They approached hills with care, knowing how sound carried across slopes. They used tall grasses to conceal movement, shallow valleys to break lines of sight, river bends to disappear from pursuit. Even the direction of the sun mattered. Light behind them could blind an enemy, while shadows could hide their approach. Combat was never separate from environment. It was woven into it. This awareness extended beyond battle. Every journey was preparation. Every hunt sharpened skills that might later be needed in conflict. Chasing game taught riders how animals reacted to pressure, how they fled, how they turned suddenly when cornered. These lessons translated naturally into warfare, where human opponents often behaved no differently than frightened prey. The Scythians did not train for war in isolation. War was simply another expression of movement on the steppe. As their reputation grew, so did this. Stories told about them by others. Greek writers described warriors who drank from skulls, who wore the skins of enemies, who moved with terrifying speed. Persian accounts spoke of enemies who could not be pinned down, who refused to defend cities, who turned retreat into weaponry. These accounts, often exaggerated, reflected the confusion of settled peoples trying to understand a way of war rooted in freedom rather than territory. Behind the legend, however, Scythian warfare remained grounded in practicality. Violence was not ritualized for spectacle alone. It was a means to protect resources, assert boundaries, and maintain balance across a contested landscape. Raids were calculated, retaliation was measured, escalation was avoided when it threatened long-term survival. Within Scythian society, not all warriors held equal status. Skill mattered. Experience mattered. Those who demonstrated exceptional ability earned respect and influence. But this respect carried responsibility. A skilled warrior was expected to protect the group, to share success, to guide younger riders. Leadership emerged through action rather than declaration. Women, too, participated fully in this martial world. Riding, archery, and survival were not limited by gender. Ancient observers noted women who rode and fought alongside men, their presence woven naturally into Scythian life. This reality later gave rise to myths of Amazons, but within Scythian society, it required no myth at all. The steppe demanded contribution from everyone capable of movement and awareness. Gold continued to play a powerful symbolic role in this warrior culture. Unlike the hoarded wealth of cities, Scythian gold was displayed, worn, and carried. It moved with the people, catching light as riders crossed the plains. In this way, wealth remained visible and shared, reinforcing identity rather than separating elites from the rest. The craftsmanship behind this gold revealed another side of the warrior culture: patience, precision, and artistry. Goldsmiths shaped animals with astonishing fluidity, capturing motion in still form. Muscles seemed to ripple, bodies twisted and leapt. These were not abstract designs. They were intimate studies of the creatures that shared the steppe. Warriors wore these images close to the body, on belts, weapons, clothing, not merely as decoration, but as reminders of strength, awareness, and balance. The animal world was not something to dominate, but something to emulate. As Scythian influence expanded, their style of warfare began to affect others. Neighbouring peoples adopted elements of mounted archery. Techniques spread along trade routes and through conflict. Even powerful empires were forced to adapt, developing cavalry units and learning to respect the advantages of mobility. Yet no matter how widely their methods travelled, the Scythians themselves remained rooted in the steppe's logic. They did not seek to build empires in the settled sense. Control through occupation did not interest them. The open land could not be owned in the way cities were owned. It could only be understood. When warriors returned from long campaigns or distant encounters, they reintegrated seamlessly into camp life. There was no sharp division between soldier and civilian. A rider who had faced enemies one season might spend the next guiding herds or repairing equipment. Identity remained fluid, adaptable, responsive. At night, after the movement and tension of the day, the steppe returned to stillness. Fires flickered. Horses shifted gently. The vast sky stretched overhead, unchanged by human conflict. In these moments, the warrior laid aside alertness and rejoined a rhythm of communal life. Stories flowed, not boasting, but remembering. Accounts of danger were framed as lessons. Victories were shared as communal success. Losses were acknowledged quietly, folded into memory. The land absorbed these stories, just as it absorbed footprints and fire scars, leaving little trace behind. This balance between readiness and restraint defined Scythian warfare. It was not an identity built on conquest alone, but on adaptability within an unforgiving environment. The open sky demanded humility, even from the strongest rider. Storms could humble armies. Winters could erase advantage. The land remained the ultimate authority. Through centuries of movement, conflict, and adaptation, the Scythians refined this way of life. Their warriors became symbols of speed and precision, feared by those who could not catch them, admired by those who studied them. Yet beneath the legend lay a quieter truth. They were shaped not by a desire for war, but by the demands of the steppe. Gold gleamed, bows sang, horses thundered, but always beneath the same open sky, the same endless grasslands that taught them how to survive, how to fight, and how to endure without ever standing still. Kings, tribes, and a shifting Scythian world. Long before the Scythians were spoken of as a single people, long before ancient writers tried to define them with names and borders, They existed as many groups moving across the same vast world. The steppe did not encourage unity through walls or capitals. Instead, it shaped identity through shared rhythms, migration, herding, survival, and memory. What we now call the Scythian world was not a kingdom in the traditional sense, but a shifting constellation of tribes bound together by landscape, culture, and movement. Each group travelled its own seasonal routes, returning again and again to familiar grazing lands and water sources. These paths were inherited rather than chosen, remembered rather than recorded. Over generations, they formed invisible territories, not fixed borders, but understood spaces where one group's memory overlapped with another's. The steppe allowed this flexibility. It demanded negotiation rather than domination. Within these tribes, leadership did not resemble the centralized kingship of settled empires. Authority emerged slowly, shaped by experience rather than proclamation. A leader was someone who knew the land, understood timing, and could guide people safely through uncertainty. Survival granted legitimacy more reliably than lineage alone. Yet as the Scythian world expanded, patterns of hierarchy began to form. Some tribes controlled especially rich grazing lands. Others dominated key migration corridors or river crossings. Over time, wealth accumulated unevenly, not in cities, but in herds, horses, weapons, and gold. From this imbalance emerged powerful families whose influence extended beyond a single camp or season. These were the beginnings of Scythian kingship. A Scythian king was not a ruler behind walls. He did not command from a throne fixed in stone. His authority moved with him, visible in the size of his retinue, the number of horses that followed, the quality of weapons and ornaments he carried. His power was recognized, not imposed. Loyalty flowed through personal bonds, shared success, and a promise of protection. Kings acted as centres of gravity within the shifting Scythian world. Around them gathered warriors, craftsmen, and families seeking stability within motion. These groupings were not permanent states, but living alliances that could expand, contract, or dissolve depending on circumstance. The steppe encouraged this fluidity. Drought, harsh winters, or pressure from neighbouring peoples could reshape alliances overnight. A strong king might unite multiple tribes for a generation, only for that unity to fragment after his death. Power was never static. It moved like the grasslands themselves, shaped by forces larger than any individual. Ancient observers struggled to understand this system. Greek writers spoke of Scythian kings as though they ruled a single nation, yet their accounts often contradict one another. In truth, the Scythian world contained many centres of power, rising and falling over time, overlapping in influence rather than obeying clear chains of command. Some kings achieved remarkable reach. Their authority extended across vast distances, connecting tribes separated by hundreds of miles. These rulers coordinated migrations, organised large-scale raids, and oversaw trade flowing between the steppe and settled civilizations. Under such leadership, the Scythian world could act with surprising cohesion, but even the most powerful king remained bound by the customs of the steppe. He could not rule against the land. He could not ignore seasonal realities. He could not command loyalty without reciprocity. Kings were expected to distribute wealth, host feasts, reward bravery, and honour tradition. Gold played a central role here, not as hidden treasure, but as visible proof of generosity and success. Lavish ornaments, weapon fittings, and ceremonial objects reinforced status while circulating wealth through the community. Burial practices reveal how deeply kingship was tied to ritual and belief. The great kurgans, monumental burial mounds, rose across the plains as lasting markers of authority. Within them, kings were laid to rest with astonishing wealth: gold objects, weapons, horses, attendants. These burials were not merely displays of power, they were acts of memory, anchoring leadership to the land even after death. The construction of a kurgan required enormous communal effort. Earth was piled high, chambers were carefully arranged, rituals accompanied every stage. Through this process, a king's authority transformed into ancestral presence. Though his camp moved on, his memory remained fixed in the landscape. These burial mounds also served another purpose. They signalled territory, not as borders, but as reminders of lineage and history. Travellers crossing the steppe recognised them as places of significance, markers of who had moved through before and who still watched, in memory, from beneath the earth. As Scythian tribes interacted with neighbouring worlds, kingship took on new dimensions. Contact with Persia, the Greek cities along the Black Sea, and other steppe peoples introduced new ideas of rule, diplomacy, and prestige. Some Scythian kings adopted foreign goods, styles, and practices, blending them into their own traditions without losing their core identity. This adaptability became a defining feature of the Scythian political world. Kings negotiated with city-states, extracted tribute, protected trade routes, and sometimes served as intermediaries between rival civilizations. Yet they never fully adopted the sedentary model of governance. Their power remained personal, mobile, and rooted in steppe logic. Tribes continued to shift, alliances changed, new leaders emerged, old ones faded into memory. The Scythian world was never still long enough to be fully captured by any single description. And beneath all of this movement, beneath kings and tribes and shifting power, the steppe endured. It remained a true constant, shaping every decision, every alliance, every rise and fall. This living political landscape prepared the Scythians for centuries of interaction, conflict, and transformation. Their kings were not builders of empires in stone, but navigators of influence across space and time. And as the world beyond the steppe took greater notice of them, these shifting structures of power would be tested in ways their ancestors could never have imagined. The balance that held the Scythian world together was never guaranteed. It existed only so long as leaders understood the limits of their power and the demands of the land. When those limits were respected, alliances endured. When they were ignored, the steppe responded swiftly, dissolving unity as easily as it had allowed it to form. As generations passed, the memory of powerful kings lingered, shaping expectations of leadership even after their influence faded. Names were remembered through stories, through burial mounds rising above the grass, through objects passed down and retold. Yet no king could hold the Scythian world in place indefinitely. Authority was always temporary, contingent on success and circumstance. This impermanence did not weaken Scythian society. Instead, it made it resilient. Without reliance on fixed capitals or rigid institutions, the political world adapted quickly to change. When one leader fell, another could rise. When one alliance fractured, new ones formed. The steppe encouraged renewal rather than collapse. Tribal identity remained strong beneath these shifting structures. Each group maintained its own customs, symbols, and internal leadership. Even when united under a powerful king, tribes retained autonomy in daily life. This decentralization allowed the Scythian world to absorb shocks that might have shattered more centralized states. Yet the relationships between tribes were not always peaceful. Competition for grazing lands, water access, and migration routes occasionally led to conflict. These disputes were rarely resolved through prolonged warfare. Instead, they were negotiated through movement, seasonal adjustment, or limited confrontation. The steppe did not reward stubbornness. It favoured those who knew when to yield and when to assert. Over time, some tribes gained reputations for particular strengths. Certain groups were known for exceptional horse breeding, others for skilled metalwork, others for martial prowess. These reputations influenced alliances and leadership choices. A successful king often drew support from diverse tribes, each contributing different skills to a shared endeavour. This diversity strengthened the Scythian world. It prevented uniformity and encouraged adaptability. Cultural exchange occurred constantly within this mobile society, blending practices without erasing difference. Language, dress, and ritual varied, yet a shared understanding of a steppe life bound everyone together. As Scythian influence spread, their political structures encountered external pressures. Powerful settled empires sought to define them, to categorize them as a single people under singular rulers. Diplomacy with Persia and Greek city-states required figures who could speak on behalf of larger groups. In response, some kings assumed roles that resembled foreign models of authority, acting as representatives rather than absolute rulers. This interaction subtly transformed Scythian kingship. While remaining mobile and personal, leadership began to incorporate elements of diplomacy, tribute, and negotiation. Kings became intermediaries between worlds, translating the logic of the steppe to those who lived behind walls. Trade amplified this role. Goods flowed across Scythian territory in increasing volume. Metals, textiles, wine, weapons. Control over routes enhanced a king's influence, protecting caravans, regulating passage, and ensuring safe movement through contested areas elevated certain leaders above others. Wealth accumulated not only through herds and raids, but through mediation and access. Yet even as external connections deepened, the internal rhythms of the Scythian world persisted. Seasonal migration continued. Camps shifted with grass and water. Decisions remained grounded in immediate environmental realities. No treaty or alliance could override the demands of winter or drought. When kings attempted to impose too much control, resistance followed naturally. Tribes withdrew support. Followers drifted away. The steppe offered escape from domination. Authority that failed to respect mutual dependence quickly eroded. Burial practices continued to reinforce this balance. Even the grandest kurgans emphasized continuity rather than permanence. A king's death marked the end of his authority, not its inheritance. Though family lines mattered, succession was never automatic. The living assessed leadership anew, guided by memory, but responsive to present needs. Over centuries, this cycle repeated. Kings rose, united tribes, negotiated with foreign powers, and left their mark upon the landscape. Then, inevitably, their influence waned. New leaders emerged. The Scythian world reshaped itself once more. To outsiders, this constant change appeared unstable. To the Scythians, it was natural. Stability came not from fixed rule, but from the ability to adapt without losing core identity. The steppe taught that nothing lasting could be rigid. This political flexibility allowed the Scythians to endure long after many contemporary powers fell. While empires rose and collapsed around them, the Scythian world persisted, reshaping itself quietly, moving where others could not follow. Kings and tribes remained threads in a larger tapestry, one woven from movement, memory, and land. No single ruler defined it. No single moment captured it fully. It existed in flux, sustained by the same open horizons that had shaped it from the beginning. And as time carried the Scythians forward into new encounters and challenges, this shifting world of kings and tribes would continue to evolve, guided always by the vast steppe beneath their horses' hooves and the endless sky above. Life in motion, camps, families, and daily survival. Life in motion required constant awareness, yet it was not lived in tension. The Scythians learned to carry alertness lightly, allowing it to blend into routine. This balance shaped every ordinary moment. A camp was never chaotic, even when temporary. Each tent had its place, each fire its distance, each animal its role within the quiet geometry of survival. Morning tasks followed familiar rhythms. Herds were released gradually, guided rather than driven. Riders spread out, scanning the land not with urgency but with practiced calm. The goal was not control, but harmony, allowing animals to graze without scattering, to move without panic. Over time, herds learned these rhythms as well, responding to gestures and calls rather than force. Within the camp, work unfolded without rigid roles. Responsibilities shifted with need. Someone mending leather one day might be guarding animals the next. This flexibility reduced dependence on any single individual and ensured continuity even in loss or absence. The steppe favoured redundancy, many people knowing the same skills, many hands able to step in when required. Food preparation was slow and deliberate. Meals were not rushed, even when supplies were limited. Eating together reinforced unity, reminding everyone that survival was shared. Elders were served first, children carefully attended to, guests welcomed according to custom. Hospitality mattered deeply in a land where isolation could mean death. Seasonal change governed everything. In spring, camps expanded as births increased among both people and animals. Summer brought longer days, faster movement, and careful management of grazing land. Autumn demanded preparation, drying meat, repairing gear, reinforcing shelters. Winter slowed life, compressing camps and sharpening reliance on stored knowledge and resources. During winter months, storytelling took on greater importance. Nights were long, movement limited. Stories filled the darkness, carrying history, instruction, and identity. These narratives were not fixed texts, but living traditions, shaped subtly with each telling. They explained why certain routes were avoided, why particular animals were respected, why ancestors were honoured. Children learned most during these quiet months. Without formal schooling, they absorbed knowledge through repetition and observation. They listened more than they spoke, watching how adults solved problems, how they reacted to danger, how they treated one another. By the time children were expected to contribute fully, they already understood what was required. Daily survival also depended on constant repair. The steppe wore everything down. Leather cracked, wood split, metal dulled. Maintenance was never finished. This ongoing care fostered patience and attention to detail. A poorly repaired saddle or harness could endanger a rider. A neglected tent could fail during a storm. Every small task carried weight. Illness and injury were part of life, but not accepted lightly. Camps relied on herbal knowledge passed down through generations. Plants were gathered carefully, used for pain, fever, wounds and infection. While medical understanding was limited, attentiveness often meant the difference between recovery and loss. Community care ensured that the injured were not abandoned. Death, when it came, was met with ritual and remembrance. Camps paused, movement slowed. The dead were prepared with care, accompanied by objects from their lives. These moments reinforced continuity, reminding the living that life moved forward, but memory endured. Burial was not an end to belonging, but a transformation of presence. Trade occasionally intersected with daily life. Encounters with outsiders brought new materials, tools, and stories. These exchanges were cautious but curious. The Scythians did not reject foreign goods, but neither did they abandon their own ways. Items were adapted to steppe life, altered to suit mobility and need. Women often played key roles in these exchanges, managing goods, negotiating value, and integrating new materials into daily use. Their influence within camps extended beyond domestic tasks, shaping social cohesion and continuity. The steppe recognized competence, not hierarchy. Conflict, when it disrupted daily rhythms, was absorbed rather than glorified. Camps adjusted routes, avoided danger when possible, and recovered quickly when violence passed. Life resumed, herds grazed, children played, fires burned. This ability to return to routine preserved psychological resilience. Over time, these patterns created a deep internal stability. Though constantly moving, Scythian life was predictable in its unpredictability. Change was expected, planned for, absorbed. This mindset allowed families to endure drought, loss, and uncertainty without collapse. Even joy was shaped by motion. Celebrations occurred during moments of abundance. Successful migrations, births, alliances. Music echoed across camps, rhythmic and repetitive, mirroring hoofbeats and wind. Dance was simple, grounded, communal. These moments strengthened bonds and reminded everyone why survival mattered. At dusk, camps settled once more. Animals were secured. Fires softened into embers. Conversations slowed. The sky widened above, stars emerging in familiar patterns. These nightly moments offered reassurance. No matter where the camp rested, the sky remained the same. Home, for the Scythians, was not a destination. It was continuity. It was family beside fire. It was movement without fear. It was knowing how to live lightly on land that demanded respect. This way of life, patient, adaptive, communal, sustained the Scythians for centuries. It allowed them to move through history without leaving cities behind, yet leaving unmistakable traces in memory, burial mounds, and the stories of those who encountered them. And as the steppe carried them onward, life remained in motion, steady, resilient, and enduring. Time moved differently within this flowing life. Days blended into seasons, seasons into years without sharp edges or measured divisions. What mattered was not how much time had passed, but how well the rhythms had been followed. A successful year was one in which herds remained healthy, children grew strong, and losses were few. Survival was the measure of time. The Scythians learned to anticipate change long before it arrived. Subtle signs signalled when to move, the quality of grass beneath the hooves, the level of water in familiar streams, the behaviour of birds and wild animals. These signs were not written down or formalised. They were sensed, interpreted, trusted. Knowledge lived in the body as much as the mind. Camps adjusted their size constantly. Families joined and separated with ease, responding to marriage, death, opportunity, or necessity. This fluidity prevented overcrowding and allowed resources to stretch further. No camp was isolated. Movement ensured connection, carrying news, skills, and memory across vast distances. Within families, relationships were shaped by cooperation rather than strict authority. Elders guided, but they did not dominate. Decisions emerged through discussion, experience, and mutual respect. Children were not shielded from reality. They were included in it, learning resilience by witnessing it firsthand. Daily survival also required constant vigilance against the unseen dangers of the steppe. Sudden storms could arrive without warning. Winds could flatten tents. Cold could kill silently. Camps were arranged to minimize risk. Tents angled against prevailing winds. Fires positioned carefully. Animals grouped for warmth and protection. These small decisions, repeated endlessly, accumulated into survival. Water was treated with reverence. Sources were protected, remembered, shared. A reliable spring or river bend became a place of return, a temporary anchor within constant motion. Disputes over water were rare but serious, often resolved through negotiation rather than violence. Everyone understood its value. Craftsmanship thrived within this mobile life. tools, weapons, and ornaments were made and repaired continually. Metalworkers shaped blades and fittings. Leatherworkers stitched hides into durable gear. Woodworkers fashioned handles, frames, and supports. These crafts were not centralized. They travelled with the people, adapting to available materials. Art emerged naturally from this process. Decoration was never separate from use. Patterns reinforced seams. Motifs strengthened joints. Beauty and function were intertwined, reflecting a worldview that valued harmony over excess. Even the simplest object carried care and intention. Children played within this environment, their games echoing adult life. They raced horses, practiced archery with small bows, mimicked migration routes. Through play, they rehearsed survival. Through imitation, they learned belonging. Illness and injury remained ever-present threats. Camps relied on shared care, tending the weak without hesitation. Knowledge of plants, rest, and rituals supported healing. Though medical understanding was limited, compassion was not. No one survived alone. When loss occurred, grief was expressed quietly. The steppe did not allow prolonged mourning. Life continued, demanding attention. Yet memory was preserved through story, through name, through ritual. The dead remained part of the community, guiding the living through remembered lessons. As camps moved onward, traces of their presence faded quickly. Grass recovered, ash scattered, paths disappeared. This impermanence was accepted. The Scythians did not seek to leave marks upon the land. They trusted that memory mattered more than monuments. Encounters with outsiders punctuated this routine. Traders, envoys, and travellers appeared at the edges of camps, bringing unfamiliar goods and ideas. These moments were observed carefully. The Scythians evaluated what was useful, what could be adapted, what should be ignored. Change was welcomed only when it served survival. Despite constant motion, identity remained strong. Language, dress, custom, and shared memory created continuity. A Scythian could recognize another across distance, not by location, but by movement, posture, and rhythm. Belonging was carried, not claimed. As night fell once more, camp settled into familiar quiet. Fires dimmed, conversations softened, the stars returned, marking time beyond human measure. Beneath them, families slept, prepared to rise and move again when the land required. This life in motion, shaped by camps, families, and daily survival, did not weaken the Scythians. It strengthened them. It taught patience, cooperation, and resilience. It allowed them to endure where rigid societies fractured. And so the Scythian world continued, moving, adapting, surviving, carried forward not by walls or cities, but by people who understood that life itself was a journey, meant to be travelled lightly and together. Rituals of fire, blood, and the Scythian gods. For the Scythians, the world was never silent. Even in moments of stillness, when the steppe stretched outward beneath an unmoving sky, unseen forces were believed to move through grass, flame, wind, and blood. The divine was not distant or abstract. It was present everywhere, felt rather than spoken, honoured rather than explained. Their beliefs were shaped by the same land that shaped their lives. A world without cities did not require temples of stone. A people always in motion did not bind their gods to fixed places. Instead, Scythian spirituality travelled with them, carried in ritual, symbol, and memory. The sacred moved as they moved. Fire stood at the centre of this spiritual world. Fire was warmth against the cold steppe nights. It was protection against darkness and beasts. It transformed raw food into sustenance and hardened metal into tools of survival. But beyond its practical role, Fire was alive with meaning. It was believed to connect the human world to higher forces, a living bridge between earth and sky. Ritual fires were treated with care and respect. Flames were fed deliberately, never wasted or ignored. Around them decisions were made, oaths sworn, and stories shared. Fire witnessed life, and in doing so it became sacred. Blood too carried profound significance. Blood was life itself, visible, powerful, irreversible. In Scythian ritual, blood marked transitions, sealed agreements, and honoured the unseen. It was not spilled casually. When blood was offered, it carried weight and intention. Ancient accounts speak of oath rituals, where warriors mixed their blood with wine, dipping weapons into the mixture before drinking it together. These acts bound individuals not just socially, but spiritually. An oath made in blood could not be undone without consequence. The gods were believed to watch, to remember, and to judge. Sacrifice played a role within this belief system, though it was not constant or indiscriminate. Animals were offered at moments of importance, before campaigns, after victories, during burial rites, or when seeking favour. Horses, deeply valued and spiritually significant, were sometimes included in these rituals, reflecting the belief that what sustained life could also accompany it beyond death. These acts were not expressions of cruelty, but of balance. Life was taken with acknowledgement. Death was not hidden. It was integrated into a larger understanding of continuity between worlds. The Scythian gods themselves were not distant figures with elaborate mythologies preserved in text. Their identities were fluid, shaped through practice rather than story. Ancient observers struggled to name them, often comparing them to Greek deities in an attempt to understand. But these comparisons only approximate deeper beliefs. At the highest level stood a sky god, vast, overarching, associated with order and authority. The open heavens that dominated Scythian life naturally became a symbol of ultimate power. Beneath this sky, God existed other forces, those of earth, fire, war, fertility, and protection. One deity, often associated with fire and the hearth, held particular importance. This presence governed both domestic life and ritual purity. Fire was not merely functional, it was watched, honoured, and maintained as a living participant in daily existence. A war god also occupied a central place, not as a figure glorifying violence, but as a guardian of order during conflict. Ancient sources describe Scythian war rituals centered around weapons planted upright in the ground, treated as embodiments of divine presence. Offerings were made to these symbols, acknowledging that war itself was governed by forces beyond human control. Rituals were simple in form, but heavy in meaning. There were no elaborate temples, no priestly hierarchies dominating society. Instead, ritual authority often rested with elders, leaders, or specialized figures who understood the correct timing and gestures required to honor the gods. Some individuals were believed to possess deeper insight into the unseen world. Diviners and ritual specialists interpreted signs, dreams, and omens. They read the future not through written prophecy, but through observation, the behaviour of animals, the pattern of flames, the outcome of small actions. Their role was advisory rather than commanding, guiding decisions while respecting collective judgment. Burial rituals revealed perhaps the deepest expressions of Scythian belief. Death was not an ending, but a transition. The deceased were prepared carefully, accompanied by objects that reflected their lives. Weapons, ornaments, tools, and sometimes companions or animals. These items were not meant as displays for the living alone. They were believed to be necessary beyond death. The construction of burial mounds transformed ritual into landscape. Earth was shaped intentionally, marking a place where worlds met. The living gathered, performed rites, and then moved on, trusting that the bond between the dead and the land remained intact. These mounds became sacred points across the steppe, not places of daily worship, but of remembrance and respect. Travellers recognised them as places where power lingered, where the past still watched. Scythian rituals did not separate belief from life. There was no boundary between sacred and ordinary. The same fire that cooked food carried divine presence. The same blood that sustained life sealed vows. The same land that fed herds held the dead. This integration gave their spirituality a quiet strength. It did not depend on permanence or monuments. It endured through movement, repetition, and shared understanding. As the Scythians encountered other cultures, their beliefs adapted without dissolving. Foreign gods were acknowledged, sometimes incorporated, but never allowed to replace the core relationship between people, land, and sky. Ritual remained rooted in lived experience rather than doctrine. This spiritual world shaped how Scythians faced danger, loss, and uncertainty. It provided meaning without rigidity, guidance without confinement. It reminded them that they were part of a larger order, one that moved as endlessly as the steppe itself. And as night fell once more, fires flickered low, shadows danced across felt tents. The sky arched overhead, silent and immense. In that space between flame and darkness, between life and death, the Scythian gods were believed to listen. Their rituals continued, quiet, powerful, enduring, carried forward into the next movement of their story. As the seasons turned and generations passed, these rituals deepened not through expansion, but through repetition. The Scythians did not seek to define their gods more clearly over time. Instead, they learned to live alongside them, accepting mystery as part of belief. What mattered was not knowing the gods fully, but honouring their presence correctly. Ritual followed the rhythm of life on the steppe. Certain moments demanded attention: the beginning of a migration, the birth of a child, the death of a leader, the approach of conflict. At these times, ordinary actions slowed and gestures became deliberate. Fires were tended with extra care, offerings were chosen thoughtfully. Words, when spoken, were measured and restrained. Silence itself held power. Many rituals involved little speech. Meaning was carried through action: the placement of an object, the direction of a flame, the spilling of liquid onto earth. The gods were believed to understand intention without explanation. Excessive words risked disrespect. Stillness allowed the unseen to draw near. The Scythians believed the land remembered these moments. Blood spilled onto the ground did not vanish. It entered the earth, joining all that had come before. Firelight did not fade without trace. It rose into the sky, carrying prayers upward. Ritual created continuity between worlds, binding present action to ancestral memory. War rituals were among the most solemn. Before battle, weapons were cleansed and honoured. Spears, swords, and bows were not treated as inert objects, but as participants in conflict. Planting a weapon upright in the ground transformed it into a symbol of divine presence. Offerings made before it acknowledged that victory and survival depended on forces beyond skill alone. After battle, rituals shifted in tone. The dead were acknowledged. Blood was cleansed from bodies and weapons. Fires burned longer, their light steady rather than urgent. These acts restored balance, ensuring that violence did not linger beyond necessity. Some rituals blurred the line between fear and reverence. Ancient accounts describe practices that shocked outsiders: the use of enemy remains in ceremonial contexts, the display of trophies taken in battle. To the Scythians, these acts were not performed for cruelty, but for power and remembrance. Taking something from an enemy was believed to absorb strength, to prevent lingering threat, to close the cycle of conflict. Yet such practices were not constant. They were reserved for moments of profound significance, governed by custom and restraint. Excessive violence offended the gods as surely as weakness did. Women played vital roles in Scythian ritual life. They tended sacred fires, prepared offerings, and participated in divination. Some women were believed to possess particular insight into the unseen world, interpreting dreams or signs with quiet authority. Their spiritual influence reinforced their social presence, grounding belief in daily life rather than isolating it in a separate class. Divination remained subtle. The future was not predicted through grand prophecy, but glimpsed through patterns. The fall of objects, the behaviour of animals, the response of flames. These signs did not dictate action. They advised caution, patience, or readiness. Choice remained human, guided rather than controlled by the gods. Burial rituals evolved over time, growing more elaborate for those of high status yet maintaining core principles. The dead were never abandoned. Even when movement was urgent, care was taken to honour the transition between worlds. Burial bound the living to the land in moments of stillness, reminding them that though they moved endlessly, memory could remain. Kurgans became places where ritual and landscape merged completely. They were not visited frequently, yet their presence shaped movement around them. Travellers slowed near them. Camps avoided disturbing them. These mounds held weight not through fear, but through respect. As Scythian society encountered foreign beliefs, Persian, Greek, and others, ritual language expanded carefully. New symbols were sometimes adopted, reinterpreted through steppe understanding. A foreign god might be acknowledged as another name for a familiar force. Syncretism occurred quietly, without erasing older practices. This openness allowed Scythian belief to endure rather than fracture. There was no single doctrine to defend, no fixed text to contradict. Faith lived in action, adaptable yet grounded. The gods of the Scythians did not demand temples or cities. They asked only for recognition, through fire tended properly, blood offered with intention, land treated with respect. This simplicity gave belief resilience. In moments of fear, storms, illness, loss, ritual provided reassurance. It reminded the Scythians that chaos was not meaningless, that unseen order persisted even when human understanding failed. In moments of success, abundance, victory, birth, ritual expressed gratitude rather than triumph. Over centuries, these practices shaped a worldview both pragmatic and spiritual. The Scythians did not separate survival from belief. The same acts that sustained life honoured the gods. The same rhythms that guided migration structured ritual. As night fell across the steppe, fires glowed softly. Smoke drifted upward, thinning into darkness. The sky stretched endlessly above, stars unmoved by human concern. Somewhere between earth and heaven, between blood and flame, the Scythian gods were believed to dwell. Not distant rulers, but constant companions. Their presence followed the people wherever they rode. And so, as the Scythian world continued to shift and adapt, their rituals endured. Quiet, powerful, and inseparable from life itself. Burial mounds, ancestors, and frozen tombs of gold. Across the vast grasslands of the steppe, where movement defined life and no city ever stood long enough to cast a permanent shadow, there were only a few places where the Scythians chose to remain still. These places rose quietly from the earth, rounded hills of soil and stone that marked the boundary between the living and the dead. Burial mounds, known today as kurgans, became the most enduring trace of a people who otherwise left little behind. To the Scythians, death did not sever belonging, it altered it. A person did not disappear into nothingness, but passed into another state of existence, one still connected to family, land, and memory. Burial was not merely an ending, it was a careful transition, guided by ritual, respect, and continuity. When a death occurred, life slowed, camps paused their movement, fires burned lower, the body was prepared with deliberate care. This preparation was not hurried, even when the demands of the steppe pressed close. Time was taken because what followed mattered not only for the dead, but for the living who would continue onward. The deceased was dressed in garments chosen to reflect identity and status. Clothing was layered, adorned, repaired if necessary. Jewellery was placed carefully. Weapons, tools, or personal objects accompanied the body, not as offerings to impress, but as necessities believed to be useful beyond death. These items told a story of the life lived, and they were chosen with intention. For those of high status, preparation could take days or weeks. The body was sometimes preserved temporarily, allowing distant kin to gather. During this time, rituals unfolded quietly, fires burned steadily, offerings were made, blood, fire, and earth once again marked the passage between worlds. The construction of a burial mound transformed death into a communal act. Earth was gathered from the surrounding land, shaped by many hands. Stones were carried, placed, and layered. This labour was not a burden, it was participation. Each person who helped shape the mound shared responsibility in honouring memory. At the centre of the mound, a chamber was created, sometimes of wood, sometimes reinforced with stone. Within it, the dead were laid to rest. Horses were often included, placed carefully, their bridles and ornaments intact. These animals were not symbols alone, they were companions meant to continue their bond beyond life. Food, vessels, and drinking horns were arranged nearby. The journey after death was believed to require sustenance, just as life on the steppe did. Nothing about the afterlife was imagined as distant or abstract. It mirrored the living world, shaped by the same needs and rhythms. Once the chamber was sealed, earth rose slowly above it. The mound grew layer by layer, becoming visible from afar. Unlike camps, which vanished without trace, these mounds were meant to endure. They anchored memory in a landscape defined by movement. Kurgans did more than mark individual lives. Over time, they created a geography of ancestry. Travellers recognised familiar mounds as signs of lineage and history. They were reminders that though the Scythians moved endlessly, they were never without roots. For kings and powerful leaders, burial mounds reached extraordinary scale. These were not expressions of vanity alone, but declarations of continuity. A great mound signalled that leadership did not end with death. Authority transformed into ancestral presence, watching over the land. Within these royal tombs lay astonishing wealth. Gold adorned clothing, weapons, horse gear, and ritual objects. The craftsmanship was intricate, deliberate, and deeply symbolic. Animals twisted and leapt across surfaces frozen in motion. Gold was shaped not to impress outsiders, but to carry meaning into the next world. Yet even the richest tombs reflected restraint. Wealth was placed where it mattered, not scattered carelessly. Every object had purpose. Excess without meaning held no value in Scythian belief. Centuries later, these tombs would astonish the modern world, especially those preserved by ice in the frozen regions of Siberia and the Altai Mountains. In these rare places, cold sealed chambers completely, halting decay. Textiles remained intact, wood survived, even skin and hair endured. Time itself seemed paused. These frozen tombs offer an unparalleled glimpse into Scythian life and belief. Tattoos preserved on skin reveal animal motifs identical to those found in gold art. Clothing shows careful tailoring suited for riding and climate. Horse remains confirmed a deep spiritual bond between rider and mount, but to the Scythians themselves, these burials were never meant to be seen again. They were sealed intentionally, protected by ritual and respect. Disturbing them was unthinkable. The dead were believed to watch, to remember, to retain influence. Ancestor reverence did not require daily worship. It lived quietly, shaping behaviour through memory rather than fear. Decisions were made with awareness of lineage. Actions reflected not only personal consequence, but ancestral judgment. To dishonour tradition was to break continuity. The land itself participated in this belief. Burial mounds altered movement subtly. Camps avoided settling too close. Paths curved gently around them. The dead shaped the living world not through command, but through presence. Over generations, layers of burial accumulated. New mounds rose near old ones, forming clusters that marked centuries of passage. Each mound added depth to the landscape, transforming empty plains into places thick with memory. As Scythian influence spread and interacted with other cultures, burial customs absorbed subtle changes. Foreign objects appeared within tombs. New techniques emerged, yet the core principles remained unchanged. Respect, continuity, and preparation for a journey beyond life. These burial practices anchored the Scythians in time. While camps vanished and routes shifted, the mounds endured. They became the quiet heart of a mobile civilization. And beneath these rising hills of earth and gold, the Scythian ancestors rested, not gone, but transformed, their presence woven into the land itself. Time passed differently within these sealed chambers. Above them, the steppe changed with each season, grass rising and falling, herds moving on, camps appearing and vanishing, yet beneath the earth silence held. In some places, cold crept downward year after year, locking the burial chambers into stillness. Ice formed slowly, gently, preserving what ritual had already set apart. These frozen tombs were never intended as monuments for the future. They were acts of closure. The Scythians did not imagine distant generations uncovering their dead. The preservation that astonishes the modern world was accidental, a gift of climate rather than intention. Yet through it, the Scythians left behind something rare. A world paused mid-breath. Within the ice, details remained as they had been on the day of burial. Felt and wool retained their texture. Leather stayed supple. Wooden vessels showed the marks of tools and hands. Even food offerings survived, still arranged as they had been placed, waiting for a journey that, in belief, had already begun. Most striking of all were the bodies themselves. Skin preserved beneath ice revealed tattoos, intricate animal forms flowing along shoulders, arms and legs. These images matched the gold ornaments found in the tombs, stags with sweeping antlers, predators caught mid-strike, birds stretched in flight. The body itself had become a sacred surface, carrying belief directly into flesh. Art was not separate from life, it moved with the person into death. These tattoos were not decoration alone, they were identity, protection, memory. Marked onto the skin, they travelled beyond life, ensuring that the individual remained recognisable in the unseen world. To the Scythians, the soul did not shed its form entirely. It carried the essence of the body with it, shaped by symbols known and trusted. The horses buried alongside these individuals were preserved with equal care. Their manes were braided, their harnesses decorated. Some wore masks shaped like animals, transforming them into mythic beings for the journey ahead. These horses were not sacrificed casually. They were chosen, honoured, and prepared as companions rather than possessions. Through these burials, the Scythians affirmed a belief in continuity. Death did not erase relationships. Riders and horses remained bound. Families remained connected. Leaders remained present as ancestors whose influence extended beyond sight. Ancestor memory shaped daily life quietly but persistently. The dead were not spoken of constantly, yet their presence was assumed. Decisions carried the weight of lineage. To act dishonourably risked more than social consequence. It disrupted continuity between generations. The living walked among the memories of those who had moved across the same land before them. Kurgans became places of orientation as much as remembrance. Travellers recognised them as markers of past movement. Routes bent gently around them. Camps paused nearby, but never atop them. Even without frequent ritual, these places demanded respect through restraint. Over centuries, this landscape of burial grew dense. The steppe, often described as empty, was anything but. It was layered with lives lived and ended, with stories sealed beneath earth and stone. Each mound added depth to the present, reminding the living that they were part of a long procession rather than a solitary moment. As Scythian society encountered new pressures, migrations of other steppe peoples, the expansion of powerful empires, shifts in climate and trade, burial practices remained one of the most stable elements of their culture. Even as political structures shifted and alliances changed, the treatment of the dead preserved continuity. Foreign influences appeared in later tombs. Greek vessels, Persian objects, imported textiles found their way into burial chambers. These items were not signs of cultural surrender, but of adaptation. What mattered was not origin, but meaning. Anything placed with the dead had to serve the journey beyond life. Eventually, as Scythian dominance faded and new powers moved across the steppe, the building of great kurgans slowed. Movement patterns changed. Traditions softened. Yet the old mounds remained. They outlasted the people who raised them, resisting erosion, resisting forgetting. When modern explorers and archaeologists finally uncovered these tombs, they stepped into spaces never meant to be reopened. Ice cracked, air returned, light touched surfaces unseen for millennia. What emerged was not merely treasure, but intimacy, the preserved evidence of belief, care, and identity. Gold gleamed as it had beneath ancient firelight. Textiles carried the warmth of hands long gone. Bodies bore the marks of lives fully lived. These discoveries transformed understanding of the Scythians, revealing complexity where legend had painted only fear. Yet even now, these tombs ask for quiet. They are not triumphant relics. They are pauses, moments where movement stopped briefly, intentionally, so that life could continue elsewhere. They remind us that the Scythians did not seek immortality through monuments. They trusted memory, land, and ritual to carry them forward. Beneath grass and snow, beneath centuries of silence, the Scythian ancestors still rest. Their world, once in constant motion, waits quietly within the earth, not lost, but held. And as the steppe continues to shift above them, wind brushing over burial mounds at dusk, the legacy of the Scythians endures, not through cities or walls, but through the quiet power of remembrance sealed in gold, ice, and earth. Encounters with Persia, Greece, and the ancient world. Beyond the endless grasslands, beyond the familiar rhythms of migration and camp life, there existed other worlds, worlds of stone cities, fixed borders, and written laws. For centuries, the Scythians moved along the edges of these settled civilizations, sometimes distant, sometimes dangerously close. When their paths crossed, the encounters reshaped not only how others saw the Scythians, but how the Scythians themselves understood their place in the wider ancient world. These encounters did not begin with conquest. They began with curiosity. At the margins of the steppe, traders arrived cautiously, drawn by horses, hides, gold, and the promise of safe passage across vast lands. The Scythians were not strangers to exchange. Goods had long moved quietly through their world, metals, tools, textiles, and stories travelling from one camp to another, but contact with great empires introduced scale and complexity unlike anything before. Persia was among the first of these powers to feel the full presence of the Scythians. The Persian Empire, vast and ambitious, sought order through administration, roads, and centralised authority. To Persian kings, land was something to be governed, measured, and controlled. The Scythians represented the opposite, a people who refused permanence, who could not be taxed, settled, or absorbed easily. When Persian armies pushed northward toward the steppe, they encountered not walls or cities, but emptiness. Camps vanished before them. Herds were moved beyond reach. Riders appeared briefly, harassing supply lines, striking isolated units, then disappearing into distance. The land itself seemed to resist Persian ambition. These confrontations revealed a fundamental mismatch in worldview. Persian power relied on holding territory. Scythian power relied on denying it. No decisive battle occurred because none could be forced. The steppe swallowed armies not through violence alone, but through exhaustion and disorientation. To the Scythians, these encounters reinforced a familiar lesson. Survival did not require dominance. It required understanding when to engage and when to withdraw. They did not seek to overthrow Persia. They sought to remain beyond its grasp. Greek encounters unfolded differently. Along the shores of the Black Sea, Greek colonies rose, cities of stone and harbour walls, bustling with trade and ambition. These settlements became points of sustained contact rather than fleeting conflict. Greeks relied on Scythian grain, livestock, and protection of inland routes. Scythians valued Greek goods, wine, pottery, metalwork, and the opportunities trade provided. Through these exchanges, the Scythians entered the written world. Greek writers observed them with fascination and fear, recording customs, beliefs, and warfare. To Greek eyes, the Scythians seemed both primitive and sophisticated, nomads without cities, yet masters of land and movement. These accounts shaped how the ancient world would remember them, even as they misunderstood much of what they described. Greek myths blurred with observation. Stories of fierce warriors, skull rituals, and Amazon-like women reflected attempts to explain unfamiliar social structures. What Greeks saw as strangeness was often simply difference, a society adapted to mobility rather than permanence. Yet the relationship was not one-sided. Scythians adopted Greek goods and ideas selectively. Wine entered ritual and feasting. Decorative styles influenced goldwork. Greek symbols appeared alongside traditional animal motifs. These elements were absorbed, not copied, reshaped to fit steppe life. Some Scythian leaders grew wealthy through this interaction. They acted as intermediaries between the steppe and the sea, controlling trade routes and mediating disputes. Their power expanded not through conquest, but through connection. These leaders did not abandon Scythian identity. They remained mobile. Their authority still depended on personal loyalty and shared success, but they learned to navigate a world where writing, diplomacy, and foreign expectations mattered. As contact increased, so did tension. Greek cities feared Scythian unpredictability. Scythians grew wary of entanglement. Trade flourished, but trust remained fragile. Encounters oscillated between cooperation and conflict, shaped by changing leadership on both sides. Further east and west, other civilizations felt Scythian presence as well. Assyrians, Thracians, and later powers encountered Scythian riders crossing borders with ease. To settled peoples, these movements seemed invasive. To the Scythians, they were natural extensions of migration and opportunity. Despite this growing web of interaction, the Scythians never fully entered the world of empires. They did not build cities to rival those they encountered. They did not adopt writing as a foundation of governance. They remained fundamentally steppe-oriented, carrying their world with them rather than anchoring it in place. These encounters reshaped how others understood power. Empires learned that not all threats could be met with walls and armies. Some could only be endured or negotiated with. The Scythians became a lesson in limits, a reminder that control had boundaries. For the Scythians themselves, these interactions expanded awareness without eroding identity. They learned the languages of trade and diplomacy while maintaining the rhythms of camp life. They accepted foreign goods without surrendering movement. They encountered gods and laws beyond their own without abandoning fire, blood, and land. As centuries passed, the Scythians stood at the crossroads of worlds, neither fully inside nor entirely outside the great civilizations of antiquity. They moved between them, shaping and being shaped in return. And in this space between steppe and city, between mobility and permanence, the Scythians carved out a unique place in history, one that would continue to evolve as new powers rose and old ones faded. Their story with Persia and Greece was not one of conquest alone, nor of isolation. It was a long negotiation between ways of life, a dialogue carried on horseback, across trade routes, and through memory. And this dialogue was far from finished. As time carried these encounters forward, the boundaries between the Scythian world and the settled civilizations grew more complex. What had begun as distant contact slowly deepened into a long, uneven coexistence. The Scythians did not stand outside the ancient world looking in. They moved through it, shaping currents of trade, warfare, and culture in ways that were often invisible to those who wrote the histories. Persian kings continued to regard the steppe with a mixture of ambition and unease. The memory of failed campaigns lingered as a cautionary tale. Rather than attempting full conquest, Persian rulers increasingly chose diplomacy, gift exchange, and indirect influence. Envoys crossed the grasslands bearing textiles, metalwork, and promises, seeking alliances rather than submission. To the Scythians, these overtures were understood pragmatically. Alliances were temporary, useful only so long as they served survival and balance. Gifts were accepted as signs of respect, not obligation. The steppe remained beyond permanent control, and both sides learned to coexist through restraint rather than domination. Greek interaction continued to evolve along the Black Sea coast. Over generations, Greek colonies and Scythian groups became economically intertwined. Grain flowed from the steppe to feed city populations. Greek craftsmen produced goods specifically tailored to Scythian taste. Markets became meeting places where languages overlapped and customs blended. Some Scythians settled seasonally near these cities, acting as protectors, intermediaries, or suppliers. Others remained distant, viewing coastal life with curiosity but little desire to imitate it. This diversity of response reflected the flexibility of Scythian society. There was no single way to be Scythian, only shared principles shaped by movement and land. Greek writers increasingly portrayed Scythians as both familiar and foreign. Philosophers used them as examples of freedom unburdened by excess. Historians described them as formidable adversaries. Poets transformed them into symbols of untamed nature. In these texts, reality and imagination intertwined, preserving an image that would echo long after the Scythians themselves faded from power. Beyond Persia and Greece, the Scythians encountered Thracian tribes, Near Eastern kingdoms, and other steppe peoples moving westward and eastward. Each encounter layered new influences onto Scythian life. New weapons appeared, decorative styles evolved, ritual practices absorbed subtle changes, yet the core remained intact: mobility, adaptability, and respect for the steppe. As centuries passed, pressure on the Scythian world increased. New nomadic groups migrated into traditional grazing lands. Trade routes shifted. Climate patterns altered grass growth and water availability. The balance that had sustained Scythian dominance began to change. Encounters with the ancient world became more frequent, more intense, and sometimes more dangerous. The Scythians responded as they always had, through movement, alliance, and adaptation. Some groups merged with newcomers, others drifted towards settled regions. Identity softened, reshaped by necessity rather than collapse. Yet even as political power waned, cultural influence persisted. Mounted archery spread widely. Steppe tactics reshaped warfare far beyond Scythian lands. Artistic motifs lived on in the work of later peoples. Burial traditions echoed through successor cultures. The Scythian way of life left traces far deeper than written records alone could capture. To the ancient world, the Scythians eventually became figures of the past, remembered through stories, tombs and artifacts. But their impact endured quietly. They had shown empires the limits of conquest. They had connected distant regions long before formal trade networks existed. They had demonstrated that civilization could move without walls and endure without cities. In the end, the Scythians were never fully absorbed by the ancient world they encountered, nor did they remain untouched by it. Instead, they existed in between, shaping and being shaped, influencing and adapting, leaving behind a legacy carried forward by others who followed the same open paths across the grasslands. As the steppe winds continued to move, brushing over old campsites and ancient burial mounds, the memory of these encounters lingered. Persia, Greece, and the great civilizations of antiquity had met the Scythians not as conquerors or subjects, but as equals in a long conversation across cultures. And in that conversation, quiet, complex, and enduring, the Scythians found their place in history, not written in stone, but carried on horseback across the open world. Women warriors and the legends of the Amazons. Across the vastness of the steppe, where the horizon offered no shelter and no separation, life demanded participation from everyone who wished to survive. The Scythians did not divide their world into rigid roles shaped by walls or laws. Instead, the land itself dictated what was required. Strength, awareness, and adaptability mattered more than tradition, and necessity often overruled expectation. In this world, women were never distant from danger, nor removed from responsibility. They rode horses from an early age, moved with migrating camps, cared for herds, defended families, and understood the rhythms of the land as deeply as any man. To live on the steppe was to be capable, regardless of gender. It was from this reality that the legends of women warriors began. Greek travellers and writers, encountering Scythian society from the edges of the steppe, struggled to reconcile what they saw with their own cultural assumptions. They came from cities where warfare, politics, and public life were largely male domains. When they witnessed women riding, carrying weapons, and standing openly among warriors, they reached for myth to explain it. Thus, the Amazons were born in the Greek imagination. To the Greeks, the Amazons were a people apart, fierce women who rejected men, lived only for war, and existed on the fringes of the known world. But beneath the exaggeration and symbolism lay a simpler truth. Greek observers were encountering Scythian women living within a culture that did not confine them. Archaeology has slowly peeled back the layers of legend. Burial mounds across the steppe have revealed women interred with weapons, bows, arrows, spears, and armour, laid to rest no differently than male warriors. These were not symbolic objects placed for ritual alone. Wear marks on bones tell a deeper story. Some women bore injuries consistent with combat. Others showed the physical adaptations of lifelong riding and archery. These discoveries confirm what ancient observers only half understood. Scythian women did fight, but they did not fight as a separate caste or rebel group. They fought as part of their communities. Warfare on the steppe was not a professional occupation reserved for a few. It was an extension of survival, and anyone capable of riding and shooting could be called upon when danger arose. From childhood, Scythian girls learned the same skills as boys. They rode alongside elders, practiced archery, tended animals, and absorbed knowledge through observation. There was no sharp moment where training began or ended. Skill grew naturally from participation. This upbringing produced women who were comfortable with weapons, unafraid of movement, and confident in open spaces. When conflict occurred, their presence was not extraordinary, it was expected. Greek accounts, however, transformed this familiarity into legend. Stories claimed that Amazons removed a breast to improve archery, that they raised daughters for war and killed sons, that they lived without men. These myths reflected Greek anxieties more than Scythian reality. They turned cultural difference into dramatic contrast, using the Amazons as symbols of chaos, reversal, and the unknown. Yet even within these myths, traces of truth remained. The Amazons were said to come from the lands north of the Black Sea, precisely where Scythian groups lived. They were skilled riders and archers. They fought with bows from horseback. These details were not invented. They were observed, then reshaped. In Scythian society, women did not abandon family life to become warriors. They balanced both. A woman might ride into conflict during one season and raise children the next. Life on the steppe allowed for this fluidity. There were no fixed institutions to restrict roles permanently. Marriage and partnership did not remove women from public life. Ancient sources suggest that women retained agency, property, and influence within families. Their voices mattered in decisions affecting movement, alliances, and survival. This equality was not ideological, it was practical. The steppe did not allow half its population to remain passive. Women also played important roles in ritual and belief. They tended sacred fires, prepared offerings, and participated in divination. Some were believed to possess heightened spiritual insight, interpreting dreams or signs. Their presence bridged daily life and the sacred, reinforcing continuity across generations. In warfare, women's participation varied by circumstance. Not every woman fought, just as not every man did, but capability, not gender, determined involvement. This flexibility confused outsiders accustomed to strict divisions. Over time, encounters between Greeks and Scythians reinforced the Amazon myth. Each retelling emphasized the unfamiliar, smoothing complexity into symbol. The Amazons became foils for Greek heroes, embodiments of the wild, the untamed, the inverted, yet the reality remained grounded. Scythian women warriors were not mythic anomalies. They were products of their environment, riders shaped by open land, archers trained through necessity, members of communities where survival demanded contribution. As Scythian influence spread and interacted with other cultures, these women continued to appear in burial mounds, in skeletal remains, in the quiet evidence left beneath the earth. Their presence challenges long-held assumptions about ancient gender roles, revealing a world more flexible than later societies often allowed. The legend of the Amazons, once stripped of exaggeration, becomes something quieter and more powerful. It becomes a reflection of how deeply environment shapes culture, and how movement, danger, and openness can dissolve boundaries that seem fixed elsewhere. Under the same open sky as the men beside them, Scythian women rode, fought, lived, and endured. Their story was not written in their own words, but it was carried in bone, gold, and memory. And as the ancient world looked northward toward the steppe, it saw not just warriors, but a mirror of its own fears and fascinations, transformed into legend. As the centuries passed, the distance between lived reality and remembered legend continued to widen. What had once been ordinary life on the steppe slowly transformed into myth as stories crossed cultural boundaries. The farther these stories travelled, the more they changed, shaped by the expectations, fears and imaginations of those who told them. For the Scythians themselves, there was no concept of women warriors as a separate category. There were simply people who rode, people who could fight, people who could protect the camp. Skill mattered more than identity. Survival did not pause to ask who should act. It demanded that someone do so. This difference in worldview lay at the heart of the Amazon legend. Greek society was structured around sharp divisions between city and wilderness, male and female, order and chaos. When Greeks encountered Scythian women who moved freely, spoke openly, and carried weapons without ceremony, it unsettled these divisions. Myth became a way to contain that discomfort, transforming reality into something safely distant and symbolic. The Amazons, as imagined by Greek writers, were both admired and feared. They were depicted as fierce, independent, and dangerous, yet always positioned as outsiders who ultimately had to be defeated, tamed, or absorbed. In this way, the myth reassured Greek audiences that their own social order remained intact, but archaeology tells a quieter, steadier story. Excavations across the Eurasian steppe continue to uncover graves where women were buried with full warrior equipment. These burials are not rare anomalies. In some regions, a significant percentage of warrior graves belong to women. The placement of weapons, the presence of riding gear, and the physical evidence on bones all point to active participation, not symbolic inclusion. Some skeletons show healed injuries, arrow wounds, broken bones, the wear of repeated riding. These marks speak of lives lived in motion, of danger faced and survived. They suggest training, endurance, and experience accumulated over many years. What emerges is not a society of mythical female-only warriors, but one where women and men shared a demanding environment that erased many boundaries imposed elsewhere. Scythian girls grew up expecting responsibility. They learned to ride early, not as preparation for legend, but because movement was life. They learned to shoot because hunting and defense required it. They learned to endure cold, heat, hunger, and exhaustion because the steppe allowed no alternative. Motherhood did not remove women from this world. Children travelled with camps, raised among horses and open skies. Mothers continued to ride, to work, to defend when necessary. The idea that strength and care were incompatible simply did not apply here. This balance shaped Scythian society in subtle ways. Relationships between men and women appear to have been more complementary than hierarchical. Authority within families often rested on experience rather than gender. Elders of both sexes were respected for knowledge and memory. Even in ritual life, women held visible roles. They tended sacred fires, participated in ceremonies, and sometimes acted as diviners. Their spiritual presence reinforced their social one, grounding belief in daily life rather than separating it into distant priesthoods. As Scythian power gradually waned and new peoples moved across the steppe, the visibility of women in warfare did not vanish overnight. Elements of this tradition carried forward into successor cultures, echoing faintly in later nomadic societies where women continued to ride, hunt, and defend. Yet the written record increasingly reflected the settled world's perspective. As history became dominated by city-based cultures, stories of steppe women warriors were preserved only as myth. The Amazon legend endured long after the people who inspired it had faded from political prominence. Ironically, this myth ensured remembrance, even as it distorted truth. Through centuries of retelling, The Amazons became symbols of freedom, danger, reversal, and otherness. Artists painted them, poets wrote of them, philosophers debated their meaning. All the while, the real women of the steppe remained silent, their stories buried beneath earth and time. Only in recent generations has archaeology begun to restore balance. Each uncovered grave adds weight to the evidence. Each skeleton, each weapon, each riding injury challenges the idea that ancient warfare was exclusively male. The steppe, it seems, told a different story all along. What the Scythian women reveal is not a society built on exception, but one built on necessity. When life is mobile, harsh, and uncertain, rigid roles become liabilities. Adaptability becomes strength. Capability becomes identity. Under the open sky, no one could afford to remain unprepared. The Amazon legend, stripped of exaggeration, becomes a mirror held up to ancient assumptions. It reminds us that history is often written by those who misunderstand what they see, and that truth sometimes survives best where no one thought to look. Beneath burial mounds, in frozen tombs, in the quiet language of bones. Scythian women did not set out to become myths. They lived as their world required them to live. They rode because movement mattered. They fought because survival demanded it. They endured because the steppe allowed no alternative. And in doing so, they left behind something more enduring than legend, proof that human societies have always been more complex, more flexible, and more surprising than the stories told about them. As the wind continues to move across the grasslands, brushing over ancient campsites and silent mounds, the memory of these women remains, not as Amazons of myth, but as real lives lived fully beneath the open sky. Their story, once obscured by legend, now returns quietly to history, where it belongs. Trade routes, art, and the animal style of the steppe. Across the open steppe, movement was never random. Though there were no paved roads, no carved milestones, and no permanent borders, invisible paths stretched across the grasslands, routes shaped by seasons, water sources, grazing patterns, and memory. Along these paths flowed not only people and animals, but ideas, materials, and art that quietly connected distant worlds long before formal empires drew lines on maps. The Scythians lived at the centre of these moving networks. Their camps rose and vanished, but their roots endured. Horses carried riders across thousands of miles, linking forests, mountains, deserts, and seas. From the edges of China to the shores of the Black Sea, goods passed through Scythian hands, sometimes knowingly, sometimes without the traders ever meeting face to face. Trade on the steppe did not resemble the markets of cities. There were no fixed stalls or daily exchanges. Trade happened when paths crossed, during seasonal gatherings, alliances, rituals, and moments of shared necessity. Goods changed hands alongside stories, news, and skills. What the Scythians offered was access. They controlled movement across lands others feared to cross. Their knowledge of terrain, weather, and distance made them indispensable intermediaries. Caravans relied on their guidance. Settled civilizations depended on their cooperation. Through this role, Scythian influence spread far beyond their visible presence. Gold arrived from distant mountains. Bronze and iron weapons moved across regions. Textiles travelled folded and bundled on horseback. Wine and pottery from Greek cities made their way inland, while furs, hides, horses, and precious metals flowed outward. Each object carried traces of its journey, absorbing meaning along the way. Yet trade did more than move goods, it shaped culture. As foreign objects entered Scythian life, they were not adopted unchanged. They were reinterpreted through steppe values. A Greek vessel might become a ritual object rather than a dining tool. Imported metal might be reshaped into familiar forms. Utility and symbolism merged. This process is most visible in Scythian art. The animal style of the steppe did not emerge in isolation. It formed at the crossroads of movement, belief, and exchange. Its roots stretched deep into the rhythms of nomadic life, into hunting, herding, and the constant awareness of predators and prey. Animals were not decoration, they were language. In Scythian art, animals twist, leap, bite, and struggle. Bodies curve unnaturally, muscles exaggerated, motion frozen in its most intense moment. Horns spiral, teeth bare, limbs fold and overlap. There is rarely calm. Energy pulses through every line. This style reflects a worldview shaped by movement and tension. Life on the steppe was never static. Survival depended on awareness, speed, and balance. The animal style captured this reality in metal, wood, and textile. Predators, wolves, panthers, eagles, symbolize power, vigilance, and dominance. Prey animals, deer, horses, goats, represented vitality, endurance, and the cycles of life. Often predator and prey appear locked together, expressing the constant negotiation between strength and vulnerability. These images adorned weapons, armour, horse gear, jewellery, and ritual objects. They moved with the people, flashing in firelight, glinting in sunlight, visible during travel and battle alike. Art was not confined to temples or halls. It lived on bodies and tools. Trade routes amplified this artistic language. As Scythian goods travelled outward, so did their visual vocabulary. Neighbouring cultures absorbed and adapted the animal style, blending it with local traditions. At the same time, foreign artistic influences flowed inward, subtly shaping Scythian craftsmanship. Greek realism met steppe abstraction. Persian motifs merged with nomadic symbolism. The result was not dilution, but enrichment, a dynamic art form constantly evolving without losing its core identity. Gold played a central role in this expression. To the Scythians, gold was not merely wealth, it was permanence in a world of movement. Unlike wood or leather, gold endured. It did not decay, it carried memory across generations. This made it ideal for ritual, status, and burial. Gold objects were crafted with extraordinary skill. Fine detail, complex compositions, and balanced forms reveal artisans deeply attuned to both material and meaning. These craftsmen may have been Scythian themselves, or skilled specialists drawn from neighbouring cultures. Regardless of origin, their work reflected Scythian values. Trade made this possible. Access to raw materials and skilled labour allowed the animal style to flourish at its highest level. Each piece became a convergence of journeys, metal mined far away, techniques learned through contact, symbols rooted in the steppe. Trade routes also shaped identity. By moving between worlds, the Scythians learned to navigate difference without surrendering themselves to it. They became translators of value, deciding what to accept, what to reshape, and what to reject. This selective openness preserved coherence while encouraging growth. The steppe itself reinforced this balance. Vast distances discouraged central control. No single authority dictated artistic style or trade practice. Instead, shared values spread organically through contact and imitation. Over time, the Scythians became known not only as warriors, but as cultural connectors. Their art appeared far from their homelands. Their influence surfaced in unexpected places. Yet they remained largely invisible in written histories. Their legacy carried instead through objects and patterns. Every animal carved in gold, every trade good reshaped by nomadic hands, every route traced across grass and sky formed part of a quiet network binding the ancient world together. And at the heart of this network rode the Scythians, moving steadily, shaping connections not through conquest, but through presence. Their art was motion made visible, their trade routes were memory made path. And this story, carried across the steppe, continues onward. As these routes continued to weave across the grasslands, the Scythian world became a living corridor between distant civilizations. The steppe did not separate cultures, it carried them. Goods moved quietly, often changing hands many times before reaching their final destination, and with each exchange, meaning shifted. A vessel crafted in a Greek workshop might begin as a utilitarian object, yet by the time it reached the steppe, it could become something sacred. Wine mixed with ritual, pottery held offerings instead of meals. Objects were not bound to their original purpose. They were reshaped by need, belief, and imagination. This fluidity defined Scythian interaction with the wider world. Trade was not simply economic, it was relational. Alliances formed through exchange. Trust was built through reciprocity. Refusal to trade could signal hostility as clearly as an attack. In this way, goods became language, expressing intent without words. As Scythians encountered artisans from Persia, Greece, and Central Asia, techniques travelled alongside materials. Metalworking advanced, casting methods refined, decorative details grew more complex. Yet even as craftsmanship evolved, the animal style remained unmistakably steppe-born. Its power lay in abstraction. Unlike the realism favoured by Greek art, Scythian animal forms did not aim to replicate nature faithfully. Instead, they captured essence, speed, aggression, alertness, tension. Limbs curved unnaturally, bodies twisted into impossible positions. These distortions were intentional, emphasizing movement over form. Such imagery mirrored Scythian belief. Life was not static, balance was temporary. Survival depended on reading motion of animals, enemies, weather, and land. The animal style encoded this awareness visually, turning lived experience into symbol. These symbols carried spiritual weight. Animals were believed to move between worlds. Birds crossed sky and earth. Predators ruled unseen territories. Herd animals followed ancient cycles. To depict them was to acknowledge forces larger than human control. Many objects likely served protective functions, guarding the wearer in travel, battle, and ritual. Horse gear was especially rich in symbolism. The horse was central to Scythian identity, and its adornment reflected status and belief. Decorative plaques, bridles, and masks transformed horses into mythic beings, elevating them from animals to companions in both life and death. Through trade, these motifs spread outward. Neighbouring cultures adopted elements of the animal style, blending them with local traditions. In Thrace, the Caucasus and beyond, echoes of Scythian design appear, sometimes faint, sometimes bold. Even where Scythians never settled, their visual language travelled. At the same time, Scythians absorbed influences without losing coherence. Persian floral motifs appeared alongside animal combat scenes. Greek shapes merged with steppe abstraction. This was not imitation, but conversation, a visual dialogue shaped by movement and exchange. Trade routes also carried stories. Along with goods came news of distant lands, shifting powers, and unfamiliar customs. Scythians learned of empires rising and falling far beyond the horizon. This knowledge shaped decision-making, guiding migration and alliance. Information, like gold, held value. Yet despite this deep integration into global networks, the Scythians never built cities to anchor trade permanently. Their routes remained flexible, adapting to environment and circumstance. This mobility protected them. When routes shifted, they shifted with them. Art, too, remained portable. Unlike monumental architecture, Scythian art was designed to move, worn, carried, buried. It travelled with the people, surviving where buildings could not. This portability ensured continuity across generations, even as camps changed location. Burial mounds preserved this legacy. Gold plaques, weapons, and ornaments sealed within kurgans froze moments of artistic expression in time. When uncovered centuries later, they revealed not only wealth, but worldview. Each piece told a story of connection between animal and human, steppe and city, life and memory. Through these objects, the Scythians speak without words. They reveal a culture comfortable with exchange, yet rooted in its own values. A society that understood movement as strength. A people who connected worlds not by conquering them, but by riding between them. In the end, the trade routes of the steppe were not lines on a map. They were lived paths, remembered through practice, reinforced through relationship, and marked by art that carried meaning wherever it went. The animal style endures as one of the most powerful visual languages of the ancient world, precisely because it was born of motion. It did not belong to a place, but to a way of life. And as the wind continues to sweep across the grasslands, passing over old roots and buried gold, the legacy of Scythian trade and art remains, quiet, resilient, and deeply connected to the open sky under which it was forged. The slow disappearance of the Scythian way of life. Change did not arrive suddenly on the steppe. There was no single battle, no final migration, no moment when the Scythians realized their world was ending. Instead, the Scythian way of life faded slowly, carried away by time as gently as grass bends beneath the wind. For centuries, movement had been their strength. Adaptability had protected them from conquest, from collapse, from the rigid fate of cities. Yet the very qualities that sustained the Scythians also made their disappearance quiet. When they changed, they did so without leaving clear endings behind. The steppe itself began to shift. Climate patterns altered gradually, affecting grazing lands and seasonal routes. Some pastures grew thinner, water sources became less predictable. Migration paths that had guided generations required adjustment. These were not disasters, but pressures, subtle, persistent forces that reshaped decision-making. At the same time, the human landscape changed. New nomadic groups moved into Scythian territories from the east. Some arrived peacefully, others with tension. They brought different languages, customs, and power structures. Encounters were not always hostile, but coexistence required negotiation. Alliances formed, conflicts flared. Over time, boundaries blurred. The Scythians responded as they always had, by adapting. Some groups merged with newcomers, sharing land, herds, and traditions. Others moved farther west or south, closer to settled regions where trade opportunities remained strong. Identity softened, becoming layered rather than singular. Meanwhile, the world beyond the steppe grew more organized. Empires strengthened borders. Trade routes became more formalized. Roads replaced remembered paths. Diplomacy relied increasingly on written agreements rather than personal trust. These changes did not exclude the Scythians entirely, but they altered the balance. Mobility remained valuable, yet it no longer guaranteed advantage. Settled powers learned to counter steppe tactics. Fortifications improved. Cavalry units adapted nomadic techniques. The Scythians were no longer unmatched in speed and surprise. What had once been exclusive knowledge became shared skill. This did not end Scythian life, but it reduced their dominance. Some Scythian leaders sought stability through closer ties with settled societies. Seasonal movement gave way, in places, to partial settlement. Camps lingered longer. Trade centres became semi-permanent. Over generations, this shift reshaped daily life. Children grew up with less distance between migrations. Horses remained central, but herds were smaller. Rituals continued, yet some lost urgency as circumstances changed. Burial mounds still rose, but fewer reached the monumental scale of earlier centuries. The old rhythms slowed, cultural blending accelerated, Scythian art absorbed foreign motifs more heavily, language shifted, names changed, identity became harder to define by appearance alone. To outside observers, the Scythians seemed to vanish, but in truth they transformed. Their disappearance was not erasure, it was diffusion. Scythian bloodlines continued within new peoples. Their customs echoed in successor cultures. Mounted warfare, steppe art, and nomadic knowledge lived on through those who followed similar paths. What faded was not influence, but recognition. Written history moved on. Greek and Persian sources turned their attention elsewhere. New threats, new empires, new narratives replaced the Scythians in recorded memory. Without cities or texts of their own, the Scythians slipped quietly from the written world. Yet the steppe remembered. Burial mounds remained. Roots lingered as faint lines in the land. Artifacts rested beneath earth and ice, waiting without urgency. The Scythians did not leave ruins to mourn. They left continuity to uncover. As generations passed, the Scythian way of life became legend, then archaeology. What was once lived experience turned into fragments, gold plaques, skeletal remains, scattered accounts written by others. And still, the disappearance was never complete. Elements of Scythian life resurfaced again and again in later nomadic cultures. The relationship with horses, the reliance on movement, the balance between independence and exchange. These ideas did not die. They travelled forward, reshaped but familiar. The Scythians did not fall. They thinned into history. Their world did not end. It loosened, and as the steppe continued to stretch beneath the sky, the echoes of Scythian life remained embedded in its openness, quiet, resilient, and unclaimed. As the centuries carried on, the Scythian way of life did not vanish in fire or conquest, but dissolved into the lives of others. What had once been clearly Scythian became shared, borrowed, and transformed. The steppe, which had always resisted permanence, absorbed its people the way it absorbed footprints, gently, without leaving sharp edges behind. New nomadic groups inherited old grazing lands. They followed familiar routes without knowing who had first traced them. Camps rose where camps had risen before. Fires were lit in places long accustomed to smoke. Much of daily life looked unchanged, even as names and languages shifted. To an outside observer, it might have seemed as though the Scythians were gone, but within the rhythms of movement they endured. The skills that defined them, horsemanship, mounted archery, seasonal migration, remained essential to survival on the steppe. Successor peoples learned them quickly, often from Scythian descendants themselves. Knowledge passed not through written instruction, but through imitation and shared experience. Art softened and evolved, and the animal style did not disappear abruptly. It faded gradually, blending into new decorative traditions. Predators still leapt across metalwork, horns still curved, motion still mattered. Even when forms changed, the underlying logic of movement remained embedded in design. Burial practices shifted as well. Great kurgans became rarer, yet the respect for the dead persisted. Graves still faced familiar directions. Horses still accompanied the departed in some regions. Memory continued to anchor identity, even as ancestral names blurred. The Scythian relationship with land remained influential. Later steppe societies inherited the understanding that survival depended on flexibility rather than possession. Territory was something to move through, not to fence. This worldview stood in quiet contrast to the expanding settled empires surrounding the steppe. Meanwhile, the written world grew louder. Histories increasingly centered on cities, rulers, and borders. Nomadic societies appeared only when they collided with empires. Without texts of their own, the Scythians became shadows in these accounts, mentioned briefly, often misunderstood, then left behind. Archaeology would one day restore their presence. Burial mounds resisted time, frozen tombs preserved detail, gold endured where words failed. Through these remains, the Scythians returned to view, not as myths or threats, but as people who lived fully within their environment. What emerged was not a story of decline alone, but of continuity without recognition. The Scythians did not disappear because they were weak. They disappeared because their way of life left little to capture in permanent form. Mobility, adaptability, and oral memory do not fossilize easily. They flow forward, changing shape. In many ways, this was consistent with Scythian values. They did not seek monuments. They trusted land and lineage to remember them. They did not aim to be recorded. They aimed to endure. And endure they did, in influence rather than name. Later, nomadic confederations carried forward Scythian practices, sometimes unknowingly. Mounted warfare evolved. Steppe diplomacy persisted. Trade networks continued to rely on intermediaries who understood distance and movement. Even the idea of freedom associated with the open steppe, so striking to ancient observers, lingered in cultural memory. Philosophers, poets, and historians continued to reference Scythians as symbols long after their political presence had faded. In this way, the Scythians became timeless. They existed not as a fixed civilization with a clear end date, but as a phase in a longer human conversation with open land. Their disappearance was not loss, but transition, a handing forward of knowledge shaped by grass, sky, and motion. As dusk falls over the steppe, the land looks much as it always has. Wind moves through tall grass. The horizon remains wide and unclaimed. Somewhere beneath the soil, gold still rests. Somewhere in the roots still followed, memory persists. The Scythian way of life did not end. It loosened its hold, spread outward, and became part of something larger, a shared inheritance carried by those who continue to live where the land refuses stillness. And in that quiet continuation, the Scythians remain, not as a people frozen in time, but as a presence woven into the open world itself. Echoes of the horse lords who once ruled the plains. Long after their camps fell silent and their names faded from the written world, the presence of the horse lords lingered across the plains. It remained not in cities or monuments, but in movement, in the way later riders sat a saddle, in the routes they followed across grass and sky, and in the quiet knowledge passed from one generation to the next. The Scythians had never ruled through borders. Their power came from understanding the land as a living thing, changing with seasons and responding to care. When their dominance eased, the land did not reject them. It absorbed them, holding their memory in paths worn faintly into the earth. These echoes were subtle. A grazing route followed by a later people traced the same logic as one used centuries earlier. A campsite chosen for wind protection mirrored decisions made long before. Even the placement of fires, the orientation of shelters, and the timing of movement reflected accumulated wisdom inherited unknowingly. The horse remained at the centre of this inheritance. To ride was not simply to travel faster, it was to see farther, to feel the land's contours through motion. The Scythians had refined this relationship until horse and rider moved as one. This understanding did not disappear. It passed quietly into the practices of successor peoples who continued to rely on speed, endurance, and awareness. Mounted archery, once a Scythian signature, became a steppe tradition. Later nomads adapted it to new weapons and tactics, but the core principles remained unchanged: flexibility, distance, and constant motion. The battlefield became an extension of the open plain, shaped by patience rather than force. These methods reshaped warfare far beyond the steppe. Empires learned to fear mobility. Fortifications rose in response to threats that could not be pinned down. Cavalry units across Eurasia borrowed from steppe techniques, transforming how wars were fought. Even when Scythian names vanished from records, their influence continued to move through armies that never knew its origin. Cultural echoes endured as well. The animal style, though softened and altered, left traces in the art of later peoples. Predatory forms, dynamic motion, and symbolic abstraction reappeared in new contexts. The idea that art could carry power, protection, and identity travelled onward, detached from its source yet unmistakably steppe-born. Burial practices echoed this continuity. Though monumental kurgans became rarer, respect for the dead remained woven into nomadic life. Graves continued to mark landscapes subtly. Horses still accompanied the departed in some traditions. Memory remained anchored to place, even as names changed. Storytelling preserved what writing did not. Among later steppe societies, tales of ancient riders, golden tombs, and fearless warriors circulated quietly. These stories were not labelled as Scythian history. They existed as ancestral memory, fragments of a deeper past shaping identity without needing explanation. In settled societies, the echoes took different forms. Greek and Roman writers continued to reference horse peoples of the north as symbols of freedom and danger. Philosophers contrasted the simplicity of nomadic life with the excess of cities. Poets invoked the image of riders beneath open skies to represent independence unbound by walls. These ideas carried emotional weight precisely because they touched something real, a way of life that had existed beyond the reach of stone and law. Archaeology would eventually uncover physical echoes as well. Gold objects, buried centuries earlier, emerged from the earth, still gleaming. Frozen tombs preserved moments of life and belief. These discoveries did not resurrect the Scythians as rulers, but as teachers, offering insight into how humans once lived in balance with motion and uncertainty. What emerges from these echoes is not nostalgia, but perspective. The horse lords remind us that complexity does not require permanence, that civilization can exist without cities, that power can be exercised through knowledge rather than domination. Their world challenges modern assumptions about progress and success. Even today, the open plains carry their imprint. Modern herders follow patterns shaped long ago. Riders still rely on instincts honed over generations. The bond between human and horse remains deeply emotional, rooted in trust rather than control. In these moments, the past feels near. The Scythians did not seek to be remembered as conquerors. They sought to live well within their world. Their echoes endure because they align themselves with forces larger than ambition, land, movement, and time. As night falls across the plains, wind moves through grass as it always has. The sky stretches wide and indifferent. Somewhere beneath the soil, gold sleeps. Somewhere in the way a rider chooses a path, memory stirs. The horse lords may have faded from history's centre, but they never truly left. Their echoes still ride the plains. As the modern world continued to reshape the plains, the echoes of the horse lords did not vanish beneath machines or borders. They adjusted, as they always had, slipping into the background of daily life where they remained unnoticed yet persistent. Roads replaced remembered paths, fences divided grazing lands, and cities crept outward, but the logic of the steppe endured beneath these layers. In many regions, people still move in response to seasons rather than calendars. Herds still follow water. Camps still seek shelter from prevailing winds. These decisions echo choices made by riders thousands of years earlier, guided by the same land and sky. Even when tools change, the wisdom remains. The bond between humans and horses continues to reflect this inheritance. Though horses are no longer central to warfare or trade as they once were, their role in shaping human consciousness remains profound. Riding teaches awareness, balance, and trust, qualities the Scythians understood intimately. To ride across open land is to experience space differently, to feel time stretch and contract with movement. This sensation connects modern riders to ancient ones without words. In cultural memory, the horse lords endure as symbols of freedom and resilience. Literature, art, and film continue to draw on images first shaped on the steppe. Lone riders against wide horizons, communities bound by movement rather than walls, lives lived in close relationship with animals and land. These images resonate because they are not entirely fictional. They are rooted in a real way of life that once flourished across Eurasia. Academic understanding has also deepened. Archaeologists, historians, and anthropologists now recognize the sophistication of nomadic societies. The Scythians are no longer dismissed as barbarians or raiders alone. They are understood as skilled managers of environment, connectors of cultures, and innovators in warfare, art, and trade. This shift restores dignity to a people long misunderstood. Through careful study, the Scythians re-emerge not as a vanished curiosity, but as participants in a shared human story. Their interactions with empires shaped global history. Their techniques influenced military strategy for centuries. Their art expanded the boundaries of expression. Yet their greatest legacy may be philosophical. The horse lords remind us that permanence is not the only measure of success, that identity can be fluid without being weak, that memory can live in practice rather than text. In a world increasingly defined by speed and change, these lessons feel quietly relevant. As modern life accelerates, the contrast grows sharper. The Scythian world valued patience. Movement followed need, not ambition. Power was exercised through restraint as often as force. Survival depended on balance between people and land, between tradition and adaptation. These values echo faintly today in communities that resist overconsumption, that prioritize relationship over ownership, that seek harmony with environment rather than domination. Even the challenges faced by the Scythians speak across time. Climate shifts, migration pressures, cultural blending, these were not unique to the ancient world. They remain human experiences. The Scythians navigated them without rigid systems, relying instead on flexibility and collective knowledge. Their disappearance seen through this lens becomes less a failure than a transformation. They did not collapse. They dispersed, leaving behind a pattern rather than a monument. As dusk settles over the plains once more, the land holds its memory without needing to declare it. Wind smooths the grass. Stars emerge one by one. Somewhere, a rider pauses, listening to the quiet. In that stillness, the echoes of the horse lords endure, not loudly, not visibly, but steadily. They survive in movement that feels instinctive, in art that captures motion, in stories that return again and again to open horizons. They survive in the human longing for freedom balanced by belonging. The Scythians may no longer rule the plains, but the plains still carry them. And as long as people ride beneath wide skies, listening to the land and trusting the path ahead, the horse lords will never truly be gone. As the journey comes to a close, the grasslands grow quiet once more, and the riders fade back into memory. The Scythians leave no cities behind, only paths, stories, and echoes carried by wind and time. May their world linger with you, calm and distant, like hoofbeats disappearing across the open plain. Thank you for listening, and rest well beneath the same wide sky they once rode.